The world is an incredibly mysterious place, and my personal feelings are that there are forces at work that we can barely comprehend. And to be honest, I don't know if we need to understand them. I'll tell you why I feel this way and what I know. It was 1965, and I was new at my job, just 25 years old and working for the government in an organization that deals with supernatural and unexplained phenomena. The program was called Project Blue Book. You might have even heard of it. Our job was to investigate reports of UFO sightings to study and scientifically analyze data pertaining to said unidentified objects. But no matter how much we investigated, there were some things that we couldn't explain. Things that we couldn't just write off as, say, a weather balloon or a mistaken identity. So one day, one of my colleagues came to me with a report that he couldn't close. It was multiple sightings of a strange creature in the woods near a small town in Maine. He didn't think it was a big deal, and so he passed the file on to me. Now, one sighting alone wouldn't be enough to raise any eyebrows or elicit a response, but this creature had been seen by multiple people, and some claimed to even have seen it emerge from a small glowing object that descended from the sky. Surprisingly, I was eventually tasked with going to Maine to investigate it all, which is what leads me to this story. Once I got to Maine, I tracked down and talked to the witnesses, and they all described the same thing: a bright light in the sky that seemed to be following them. You could tell just by talking to them that it was genuine, that they were truly terrified, and some were scared for their safety, and it wasn't hard to see why. I tried to reason through an explanation as a natural phenomenon the best I could, saying it was this or that, and giving them the best scientific answer I could, which is what we always did with the witnesses. But something nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than meets the eye. This one really felt different somehow. So, I did some digging. And honestly, what I found will stay with me forever. So I'll just give it to you straight. The government is hiding something. Basically, they know something. Something big. They know about and are covering up an alien presence on our planet. While I was in Maine, I was out walking in the woods near where the sightings had been reported. I was using our detecting equipment and was getting some really strong readings. I was actually quite surprised at this. I followed the equipment, which pulled me nearer and nearer to the strong frequencies it was detecting. I was now about 2 miles from my car, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that I wouldn't have ventured to this area without the equipment, and that's when the equipment started reading frequencies I have never seen before. Of course, I cautiously continued, not knowing what to expect, and that's when my entire idea of the world changed. That's when I saw it. A creature. A small yet humanoid creature, with big black eyes and weird, almost reptilian-looking skin. I knew instantly that I had successfully tracked an alien, and every cell in my body then knew that the sightings I had come there to investigate were real. This creature was crouching next to a rock, and the area next to the rock was basically devoid of much vegetation, and the ground was completely cleared. It was obvious that this was a purposeful clearing out of the brush. I stood there contemplating my next move. I didn't know whether to or how to successfully approach it. I then wondered if I had arrived just before something was about to happen, given its proximity to the cleared area. But before I could make a decision on what to do next, it turned towards me. And then, it did something that I will never forget. It cocked its head and looked intensely at me. Not in a way that felt menacing, but in a way that felt curious. In that moment, I knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't here to hurt us. It was just curious, like a child. But I also knew that the government would never allow the public to know the truth about this thing. It stared at me for a long time, and I just stood there staring back. It was almost as if we were communicating, but with silence and our eyes. I softened in those moments and didn't feel scared. But before I could act upon my now relaxed feelings, there was a loud humming that lasted only seconds and a quick explosion of light. My eyes blinked, then opened to those floating lights blocking my vision. You know, the kind you get after you look into the sun? I looked around to find the creature, but never did see it again. And now I knew I had a decision to make. Should I report what I really saw, or return and write up a report like I always did? A report stating that the witness sightings were all easily explainable with scientific data. I choose the later. Somehow in those few seconds I had come to feel empathy for that creature and wanted to protect it. It was all clear to me now that the government was trying to track these things down to keep them hushed, keep their existence from the public. So for all of these years I have kept what I saw a secret. I never even told my coworkers what I saw when I got back. All I can hope is that all is well with that curious little creature and that it was able to return to its home. I can't believe I'm telling this story. I was 8 or 9 years old and I was a very quiet kid. I always had my nose in a book. It was a good way for me to escape since my mom was such an emotional abuser. During that time, I was really into mystery stories. My dad was frustrated with me because he wanted me to read biographies and stuff like that. To improve my mind, I liked those too, but I couldn't get enough of the mysteries. I guess I fancied myself an amateur detective after reading so many. I had changed schools a lot since my dad was always searching for one that worked with his quirky views. That year, he had enrolled me at a parochial school. We had to wear uniforms every day. It was pretty rigid, but I liked my teachers, except for Sister Virgilius, our religion teacher. She was ancient and looked about 100 years old. Nothing against old people. I love old people. She wore the full-length traditional black habit with all the accessories that go along with nun life. She looked so mean and was so strict and grouchy, probably for a good reason. Since I was so quiet, it wasn't easy for me to make friends. I did have one friend, though. Her name was Brenda, and we had really bonded over our mutual love of mysteries. The school didn't have a playground, so at recess every day they would take us across the street to play at this park. The teachers were very lenient when we were outside, and we were allowed to roam all over. At one corner of the park was this really old white brick building. Brenda and I were obsessed with this building. All the doors and windows were bricked up, so the whole thing was just a giant white brick structure. But you could see the outlines where the doors and windows had been. Just faint lines. We would spend most of the recess going round and round examining the place. We always hoped we'd be able to find a way in. We got our hopes up for a while when we discovered some stairs down to an old cellar door. That was the only door not bricked in, but it was nailed shut. The only other access was the old mail slot next to where the entrance door had been. You could still push that mail slot and look in. Why would they leave that unbricked? When we looked through there, all we could see was a dark, cavernous room and a bunch of tables. The place really had the feel of an old asylum, but it was completely unmarked. Brenda and I were convinced beyond doubt that something was going on in there, mainly because of the clicking sounds. I mean, it obviously seemed completely abandoned. But if you listened at the mail slot, there were these intermittent clicking sounds. There was no pattern to the sounds, but we heard them regularly. It was too loud to be an insect, but it sounded like it came from something alive. One night in the fall, the school was having an open house. It was a chance for parents to talk to teachers and for students to show off their work. The whole school was buzzing with all those people making their way through, checking out all the classrooms. Brenda grabbed my hand and pulled me over to the refreshment table so we could steal some cookies. We weren't supposed to take anything until all the presentations were done. I had just gotten hold of a cookie bar when an old hand came down on top of mine. I looked up and saw Sister Virgilius glaring down at me. I snatched my hand away and ran down the hall with Brenda, and we burst through the front door and ran across the street to the park. We had never been there at night before. We were standing in the middle of the park, and we looked over at the building. The outlines around the windows and doors were glowing, just hairline cracks of light shaped like windows and doors. It was the most surreal thing ever. We whispered to each other and agreed to quietly approach the building. I can't even believe we went over there. It was like our detective personas kicked in and we weren't even appropriately afraid. As we got closer to the mail slot, we started to hear the clicking sounds. They were much louder than we had ever heard them. We crouched down and slowly pushed the mail slot and looked in. There were several lanterns around on the tables, like the kind you would take camping. Coleman lanterns, I think they are called. There were two unnaturally tall and skinny men standing at one of the tables. They had no clothing and were incredibly pale. The clicking sound seemed to be coming from them. They were crouched around something laying under a sheet on the table. We could not tell at all what was under the sheet, but it seemed to be pretty much the length of the table, adult human size. One of the creatures bent its head down, and the clicking got really loud. Suddenly it made some kind of contact with whatever was on the table, and there was like a sharp intake of air. It reminded me of a Dementor's kiss or something. You know, like in Harry Potter? The thing under the sheet started struggling then, and suddenly we realized we should be very afraid. We looked at each other just horrified, and we ran away from the building as quietly as we could. We ran back into the school and hunkered down by a window, trying to see the building. But it was hidden from our view. Sister Virgilia saw us there and thought we were hiding from her. But she was nothing at all after what we'd seen. I have a story to tell, but it could potentially get me into some trouble, so I'm going to leave out any clearly identifying details in the hopes it stays anonymous enough there won't be any blowback. What I will say is this. Many years ago, I worked as a detective for the state police in a state where there are several Native American reservations. Often, we would get called to assist the reservation police on cases that were too complicated for them to solve with their limited resources. As with most things on the reservation, their police forces are often underfunded and with limited staff. This particular case was what appeared to be a homicide. A guy from the reservation, one that none of the neighbors particularly liked, might I add, was found evidently beaten to death out in the middle of an otherwise empty field. He was wearing sweats and a t-shirt, no shoes, and looked like he'd been pulled right off the couch except for the fact that the bottoms of his feet were so worn out. He'd been running for a long time before whatever happened out there happened. That wasn't the only strange thing about this case, though. It had rained earlier in the day, and we were able to find his footprints in the mud several places leading from his house to the open area where his body was found. The back door of his house was wide open when we got there, and his barefooted tracks were in the mud right from the start. He hadn't been pulled off the couch. He was chased off the couch. Only there was only one human set of footprints. I repeat, only one human set of tracks. At several points along the way, we also found what appeared to be large deer tracks running alongside his. When I say large deer tracks, I don't mean large like an elk. I mean large like a human-sized foot, but hooved like a deer. These tracks were also in his front yard, though, in fact, right by the living room window, which had been shattered from the outside. The general consensus among most of the investigators was that someone had come to settle a score with him, and since it was close to Halloween, the assumption was that they'd been wearing some kind of costume to freak him out. It was his brother who told me there was another explanation, but once you hear it, you'll understand why I never bothered to present it to my coworkers as a possibility. It's absolutely crazy sounding, but my personal belief is that it's true. You see, this guy had been poaching for as long as he'd been old enough to hold a gun. He didn't have a whole lot of respect for wildlife or game laws and used some pretty unethical hunting practices, like baiting and spotlighting deer while out on his hunts. He'd told his brother that one night he was out trying to bait a buck in when he came face to face with a Wendigo, but somehow managed to escape. The problem with escaping a Wendigo, though, is that according to the folklore, you never really do. Once a Wendigo has set its sights on you, it doesn't give up. This guy had about made himself crazy over the last few months, telling his brother about how this Wendigo was following him around. He'd quit his job over it when the thing kept showing up at work. He'd even stopped leaving the house for the most part and had been pretty close to hermit status at the time he was killed. The brothers' thoughts were that the Wendigo got tired of waiting for the guy to come back out of his house and took matters into its own hands, breaking out the front windows and running the guy out the back door. I know what you're thinking. The guy was a kook afraid of a Wendigo, so why wouldn't someone dressed as a Wendigo come around trying to prank him? The proof for me is in what was found in the broken glass of that broken window. Not only was there blood and short deer hairs all caught up in the glass, but at one place in the shattered remains of the glass, there was a thin strip of satin, the exact kind you'd pull of a deer's antlers. The story took place when I was about 16. It was 2009 in South Carolina, early in the morning before the sun came up. Every morning I would take our dog out to his run before I left for school so he could have some outside time. My mom was home that day, so she would be able to watch him while he was out there. I noticed while on the way out to the run, I saw over the trees to my left a set of 3 lights spaced out evenly that I've never seen before in that direction. We lived in a very rural area, so there were no big buildings, no water towers in that direction, nothing other than woods. I had lived there for years, so I really know what's in the area. I noticed since the lights weren't far away, I tried to listen for a sound as to try to debunk or figure out what those 3 lights were. Being down in South Carolina, we do have a lot of naval and air bases in the area, so I tried to see if it was some type of plane. Even though the planes I've seen have never had those type of lights, and I've been to air shows, and I've never seen lights spaced out quite like this. I should also mention that the lights did periodically turn off and come back on in order from left to right. I stood there quietly for about 3 minutes, staring at these lights, noticing that there's no sound. They don't move in any direction, and the sequence of the lights turning on and back off and then back on repeatedly from left to right really threw me off. These lights weren't terribly far away, but they weren't very close either. I eventually had to take the dog to the runner so I could catch my bus in time, so the runner was about 25 feet away from the spot I was standing in. From the runner, I could not see the area of where the lights were. So I made sure to clip him quickly and run back to the spot, so I'd have a chance to watch it for another moment before my bus came. It was a very short span of time, I'd say about 30 seconds. By the time I rushed back to the spot, the lights were gone. With the lights I've seen from other people's encounters and pictures, I can definitely say that this was a UFO spacecraft, and also the first that I've seen. I never saw those lights in that area again. I did mention it to my mother since she and I always believed in the things that weren't believed by many others. She never mentioned that she saw anything like that, but at least if she ever saw them, she would know that she's not the only one. Looking back now, even though it was early morning, I heard no birds or wildlife in the area. My dog was noticing my behavior, but I feel he also sensed something was not quite right. I used to be a railway maintenance worker. I'm now retired but have a ton of stories from those days. Some are pretty dark and sad, like bodies being found on the tracks, both human and animal. But generally, servicing the rails was a steady and decent job. Not too overtaxing in terms of physical labor back when I could still lift a decent amount and had good cardio. These days, retirement has given me a bit of a belly, but I'm enjoying myself. The dogmen aren't uncommon creatures for railroad maintenance workers to see, especially out in remote areas. Some stretches of track go through the middle of nowhere, big forests for miles, or just fields once you get further out west. In fact, if you're on the right crew, there's a good chance everyone will end up telling stories one night around a beer or two of what they've seen or experienced. Most of the stories are unbelievable to the point of being funny, but every once in a while I'd hear one that would give me the chills. This happened when I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and got sent out with a crew to work on a track running south. We started out early in the morning and got our gear on, mostly reflective jackets, boots, tool belts. The crew takes out a string of machines that can do everything we need out there: relaying track, taking out or putting in new ties, leveling. It's loud, dirty, and dangerous work, so everyone needs to be focused on the job. But every once in a while, if there's a lull, like if we're moving from one section to the next, you can take a good look around. The afternoon this happened, I was on a crew of about 10 guys, and we were just finishing up leveling a section that had gotten washed out by heavy rain. There were a few new guys on the crew, and one was in his early 20s. His name was Anthony. He was up ahead of me on the track, securing the new ties, when all of a sudden he shouted, "The machinery is extremely loud, so it's hard to hear," but I saw him jump up on the car out of the corner of my eye and looked up. He was pointing out into the woods. This was an area near a river, so we had a decent view down to the water and then across, where a pump house was stationed on the other side. Not sure if it was active or not. I and another service worker followed to where he was pointing and saw what initially looked like a stray dog sniffing around the building. But it quickly became obvious that this wasn't someone's dog. Even from across the river, we could tell it was huge. It stood up on hind legs, bipedal, and moved a little awkwardly around the side of the building. We could now see it better than Anthony could. He had scrambled over to where we were on the tracks and asked what the hell it was. The other guy with us told him, "That's a dog, man." Anthony looked both scared and like he didn't believe us. The three of us watched the dog man, which didn't seem bothered by the loud sounds coming from our side of the river, as it checked out the pump house. I'm not sure what it was looking for, but every few seconds it would get back down on all fours and seem to be sniffing around the edge. From what I could tell, it was a sort of gray-brown with a longer snout that reminded me of a German shepherd we had growing up. When it stood again, we could see that it was hunched over a bit, as if it wasn't used to standing upright. But it moved around easily enough, and when it reached for the single window on the pump house, there were hands where there should have been paws. We could see the fingers as it made a fist and knocked on the glass, as if trying to see if someone was in there. If there was, I don't blame them for not coming out, but it was probably empty. Most pump houses these days are set to operate on their own with regular check-ins by maintenance workers. Anthony was still freaked out and sticking pretty close to us. We had about another minute or two of watching the dog man, and the guy with us muttered that he had to be close to 7 or 8 feet tall. If the creature had been standing next to our machines, it would have had no problem reaching the roof of the lead car. Someone up ahead called that the section we were working on was all clear, and the lead car started up again with a groan, and what can sound like a car backfiring. That caught the dogman's attention. We'd climbed back up on the car that would pull us to the next section, but could still see the dogman as we were moving slow at first. When the bang sounded, he turned quickly toward the river and seemed caught off guard. He must have seen the movement of the machines and the crew through the trees, but didn't make a move to run or try to hide. For the rest of that day and afternoon, Anthony was in a bit of a daze. That night, we stayed in a small town that had a decent pub where a bunch of us went to grab a drink. We went around talking about other dogman sightings, either things we'd seen or that we'd heard other workers seeing on the tracks. I think our goal was to reassure Anthony that the dogmen aren't necessarily out to hurt you. I've only ever heard of them causing trouble, and the one we saw that day seemed to be looking for someone to scare. But he wasn't convinced, and he didn't last too long after that. I think he moved on to a desk job. When I was young, I lived in Salem, Massachusetts for a little while. I don't know if you know anything about that area, but it's definitely associated with a lot of strange history. We lived near the Chestnut Street district, which has some of the oldest houses in the country. We didn't have one of those fancy mansions like in the actual district. Our house had quite a few rooms, but it really needed some attention. I really loved that house, though it had a tall staircase with the best banister to slide down. And it had these cool French double doors with a lot of square panes of glass. There was a claw foot tub in the upstairs bathroom. I was 5 or 6 years old, and I was really happy there, but for some reason I did not feel comfortable in my room at night. I'd be trying to fall asleep, and I would seem to sense someone circling around my bed. Usually when I opened my eyes, I wouldn't see anything. But a couple times I thought I saw a woman sitting at the bottom of my bed holding a child. She just sat there staring at the child in her lap. It didn't seem very old, maybe 3 or 4. It seemed to have dark splotches on its arms and legs. It looked like it was wearing a bonnet, but the apparition or whatever it was seemed really faint. Just shadow, and it seemed to come in and out of focus. And like I said, it only happened a couple times. But the feeling of discomfort I had was often there. I would feel too warm and want to kick off my blankets. But I was too afraid to uncover myself. I would call out for my mom and dad. They would come up to see what was wrong, but I seemed to know they wouldn't believe me if I told them. So, I always complained that something hurt. Then one of them would usually stay with me until I fell asleep. My brother slept in a bed next to me in the same room. He never seemed to notice anything, but he was a lot younger. I spent most of my time outside. My mom didn't like any of the neighborhood kids to come in the house. She was really fussy about anybody making a mess, and she really didn't want to have to provide any of them with snacks or drinks. They would come fetch me to play by standing at the front window with their faces pressed against the glass. When I noticed them, I would go out to play. They knew better than to knock on the door or ring the doorbell. She really didn't care much for children. I was allowed to roam all up and down the block. I was even allowed to go to the candy store on the corner. Well, to me it was a candy store, but I bet it was a store for all kinds of things. I would choose my candy, and then if I had enough money left over, I would buy a pinwheel. I loved those things for some reason. I would blow on it to make it spin all the way home, and then I would plant it round the rose garden in the backyard. I had gotten quite a collection of them. The rose garden was one of my favorite things about that old house. It was planted in a circular brick border and had the old-fashioned kinds of roses, the ones that smell so sweet. My friends and I would crush the petals and make perfume out of them. There were 4 or 5 kids in the neighborhood that I was good friends with. When the weather was warm, we would walk to kindergarten together in the morning. We were in the same class, so we were usually on the same page as to the games we liked to play and the songs we liked to sing. One afternoon, we were in my backyard together. That morning at school, we had been playing Ring Around the Rosies. My rose garden seemed to remind us of the song, so we joined hands and started to circle around. Ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. We went round a few times and fell down laughing. About the 3rd time, as we were all getting up, something really weird happened. All of the pinwheels around the roses started spinning and whirring so fast. There wasn't any wind. It was hot and sunny. We stared at the pinwheels, and honestly, it felt really creepy. We stopped the game then, and everybody just kind of wandered off home. I went inside and went to the living room to find something to do. I had just sat down on the floor when I noticed someone at the front window with their face against the glass. I thought that was weird since we had just left each other. I stood up to see who it was, and it was the child from my room, the one with the bonnet and the splotches on its skin. I ran out of there fast. My mother didn't know what I was talking about, especially as the child was gone when we went back. But I was the most scared I had ever been. As an adult, I researched the history of that house. I discovered that one of the original inhabitants was a woman who had fled England to escape the bubonic plague. Her child had died from it. I also discovered that the roses rhyme came from the plague that affected London in the year 1665. The rhyme seems innocent but has a dark meaning. The roses stand for deadly rashes. The posies were supposed to prevent the illness. The tissues imitated sneezing symptoms. And the implication of everyone falling down is, well, death. I'll never forget this really weird thing that happened a few Christmases ago. The circumstances weren't great. It was when we had all temporarily moved back to Lake Superior to be closer to Mom, those being her final few months and all. My sister and her new husband were staying in a rental, but my little brother and I slept at Mom's. It was obviously going to be a bleak holiday, but my brother-in-law was really making an effort to come through for us. He did his part to try and brighten our days. Mom really liked him too, and seeing her happy made me like the guy a little more. On Christmas Eve, my brother-in-law suggested a family hike through the surrounding wilderness. Mom and my sister were more than happy to stay home, and after some persuading on their end, they convinced my little brother to stay back with them. So, my brother-in-law and I headed out by ourselves. We hopped in the truck and began the short drive to the base of the hike. I remember that the weather that day was menacing. We drove down a long, flat, ice-covered road for a while, making small talk here and there. I had no problem spending one-on-one time with this guy. As a matter of fact, I was sort of hoping he'd be a little uncomfortable and start making a fool of himself to impress me or something, but the guy was cool as a cucumber the entire time. We pulled off the road and parked in an empty lot next to the trail sign. We grabbed our packs, made sure we were sufficiently bundled, and embarked on the hike. We were both silent for a while, just taking in the beauty of the frostbitten wilderness around us. After a while, though, a light snow began to fall, and soon the measly trail was covered. We couldn't exactly see the trail at this point, but we pressed on in the direction we had been going. After half an hour of trudging through the snow, I was getting a little ticked off. I can't place it now, but I remember feeling something awful for my brother-in-law, but only for a minute at least. Staring at the back of his head as we trudged through snow, I pushed the thoughts away. A little while later, he stopped in place, and I nearly ran into the back of him. All at once, something putrid filled the air, and there was no question, this smell was death. It must have been a decaying moose that got stuck somewhere and froze. Maybe there was another one close by. It was overwhelming. The death was larger than one dead moose. I suggested that the smell was coming from a dead animal, still facing the back of the guy's head. I didn't want to see his face. If he looked like he was going to puke, I was going to puke. "It's coming from over there," he said almost robotically, and he stepped off the trail we had been following. He began trudging into the thick wilderness to our right, without turning to face me once. I called after him, but he just kept walking toward something. I weighed my options. I could either stand there in the rotten air by myself and wait for him to return, or I could follow him. I didn't want to be alone out there. By the time I made my mind up, he was several paces in front of me, and we were off the trail and it was snowing, so I couldn't exactly reach out and force him to stop. Whatever he was moving toward was bad. I couldn't only smell it, I could feel it. As we moved, the smell got unbelievably worse. It was as if we'd wandered onto an old dumping ground filled with decaying roadkill, but it was so much worse than that. A loud noise came from deeper in the woods, from what must have been the source of the awful stench. My brother-in-law sped up and outpaced me. I lost sight of him. I was terrified to be alone out there. The snow was really coming down now, and I asked myself why I ever agreed to go hiking in the middle of winter with this crazy guy. I was snapped out of my own thoughts when I saw it. I thought at first that I was looking at an animal deer legs and matching hooves, snowy and tussled. But then, my eyes moved up its body, and I couldn't even find it in myself to scream. The fur of the thing's deer hips curled in toward an emaciated abdomen and ribcage of a human. The skin was torn and stretched and mangled, with pieces of bloodless flesh hanging off. At the 7-foot mark, the skinless head of the creature stared straight at me, with glowing yellow eyes. It stood about 10 feet in front of me, towering above the snowdrifts around it. I saw its gummy lips pull back into an evil grin, revealing teeth as sharp as nails and a black tongue. The smell immediately got worse, and it started toward me. There was nowhere to go. I still can't believe what happened next. In comes my brother-in-law with a flare. Like a seasoned quarterback, he threw the lit flare straight at the beast, it bouncing off the thing's bony chest and onto the snow in between the two of us. As the flare's light intensified, the monster unleashed a piercing screech and arched its back. The evilness in its eyes became uncontainable, and it bolted into the wilderness, away from us. My brother and I didn't need to say anything to each other. We just ran back to the car, thanking our lucky stars that we made it out alive. We're still not sure if it was real or not, maybe just a winter-induced hallucination or something. But I know that whatever I stared into that day in the woods was a different sort of evil. I especially like when the stories are about unexplained occurrences and creatures in the woods. I think if anyone spends enough time in the outdoors, they'll eventually come across some strange things they can't explain. Whenever I sat around a campfire with my uncles as a kid, they'd tell me scary stories about things they saw in the forest. Almost everyone in my family owns property on the outskirts of the Finger Lakes National Forest. My backyard is just up against it. The forest sits on a ridge called the Backbone between Lake Seneca and Lake Cayuga. My family has been hunting and trapping the area for 5 or 6 generations. We joke that the forest is our ancestral lands because we have been here for so long. In the early spring, I hike up to the peak of the Backbone and set beaver traps along the streams that flow down into the lakes. My family used to make most of its money on beaver pelts at the turn of the century. Now it's just a hobby for us that's been passed down for generations. I'm actually an accountant by day. I'm sure my great-great-grandparents are horrified. I check my traps early every morning before I head into work. On days that I work from home, I'll sometimes check them again before sunset. Last season, I was walking my trap line before work when I saw some disturbing things. The traps that were triggered all had mostly eaten beaver carcasses in them. Blood, bone, and shredded beaver meat littered the rocks and weeds around the traps. It looked like someone shoved the bodies through a wood chipper. It was a grisly scene, but nothing so far from the ordinary that I should be spooked. Predators getting to your trap line is a regular problem. What did startle me about the situation was the scent left behind and the damage to the traps themselves. My traps are heat-treated steel, built for heavy use, but they still had massive gashes and dents in them. No animal, not even a bear, has enough power in its jaws to crumple steel like that. The traps had an oily coating on them that smelled like rancid meat. At first I thought it was the beaver carcasses, but the kills were too fresh to smell already. Whatever creature had ransacked my line left behind a distinct smell of musty, rotten meat. I talked to my uncles about the incident, and one of them reported a similar situation: ransacked traps and the smell of rancid meat. His trap line was not far from mine, so it was an easy jump to assume the same animal that destroyed my trap line did the same thing to his. This happened twice more, and we began to joke that a zombie bear was roaming the hills. We laughed about it, but I was starting to get spooked, and I could tell my uncles were too. We decided we needed to figure out what was going on. So we bought a bunch of trail cams and placed them around our traps. They were simple motion-activated cameras that would snap a picture if anything moved inside their field of vision. For a few weeks, we didn't see anything. It wasn't even beaver season anymore, but we kept throwing out traps anyway. I'm not advocating poaching, but we really wanted to find out what that thing was. Finally, one of our cameras caught something. I knew we had something before I even looked at the camera when I saw the ransacked trap. The familiar smell of rotting meat was present, and I found patches of hairy skin hanging from low branches and bushes. It looked like the creature's skin was molting off, like in those nature documentaries when the snakes shed out of their skin. I took the SD card out of the camera and nearly ran the whole way back to my car and sped home to see what was on it. The pictures weren't the best quality, but you could clearly make out a dog, wolf-like head with eyes glowing in the moonlight. But there was something wrong with the way it was built. It wasn't just that it was way too big to be a dog or coyote. It had a huge humped back and broad human-like shoulders. The camera was black and white, so I couldn't tell what color the creature was, but the picture was clear enough to see that the thick fur around its head and neck thinned out around the body to show light-colored, maybe gray skin underneath. There isn't much else I could tell from the first picture, but a succession of photos taken as the creature moved showed that it could even stand on its hind legs. I thought we had solid proof of a wolf-human hybrid. I sent the pictures to the Fish and Game Commission, the National Forestry Service, and some local news outlets. Nobody took it seriously. The local news was the only one to run the story, but they treated it as more of a joke. I'm not even angry about it, to be honest. I'd assume it was just Photoshop or something if I saw the pictures. A park ranger I knew took a look at the pictures and checked out the site of the traps with me, but he said it was probably a black bear with a bad skin infection, like mange, that was making it look and smell like that. But I've since become an expert on bear anatomy after obsessively trying to figure it out, and no bear is built like the creature I have pictures of. The legs and shoulders are too human-like. I still hunt and trap, but I always carry a rifle on me now, and I never spend the night in the trees. I was on my way to my uncle's funeral when I saw Bigfoot. It's funny because I probably wouldn't have even gone except that I hoped he'd leave me some money. Fat chance though, because he never had much, and if he did, his loser son would get it. But I thought it was worth a try, and even if he didn't, maybe his sister, my Aunt Sue, might give me a few bucks. I had to drive all the way to Ames from Cedar Rapids, where I live, and I wasn't sure my old truck was going to make it. There's a whole lot of nothing on that drive. It's not even interstate. You take State Highway 30 west. The worst thing on that truck was the tires, and that's what I learned when I blew one in the nothing between Cedar Rapids and Marshalltown. Scared the crap out of me when the truck dropped on the passenger side. I wrenched it off the road onto the shoulder. It was summer and pretty hot, so I was glad at least I'd broken down near a bunch of trees, a windbreak, I guess, for all the cornfields. I had a donut spare under the seat, but it was hell to get it out along with that cruddy little jack they come with. I grabbed the lug nut wrench and loosened the nuts before I started jacking up the truck. Just as I got it up and pulled off the tire, I heard a car stop in front of mine. At this point, I didn't care because I'd already done the hard part, so I ignored it and kept putting the donut on. I heard boots scrape on the pavement and looked up to see this big guy. I didn't like the look of him. He had greasy hair and a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth. "You need some help?" he said. "No thanks, I got it," I said. "Good," he said. "'Cause I'm not gonna help you. I'm gonna rob you." "Oh, come on, man," I said. "I got $10 in my pocket for gas and that's it." He grabbed my hair and pulled. I had no choice. I had to stand up. He was right in my face with his nasty meat breath. "I got nothing," I said. "You got $10. I want it," he said. I was reaching into my pocket when I heard a whooping yell. We both looked toward the sound. I thought at first that I was looking at a dude in a gorilla suit, but there was no way. It was too believable and not quite gorilla-like either. Besides, no one is that tall. That thing had to be 10 feet at least. It was barefoot, and its feet were huge and hairy. Really, what it looked like more than a gorilla was one of those drawings of prehistoric humans, only bigger. I just couldn't get over the size. And it had hair, or bear-like fur, really, all over except for its face. It glared at us with its black eyes, almost as if we'd woken it up, and then it yelled again. Not words like pre-words, like it was learning to talk. It was angry, though, anyone could see that. And then it started to walk toward us. The dude who was trying to rob me looked scared as hell. He stared at it like he was frozen, and then he ran to his car and left, peeling out like he was running from the law. I would have gone too, except that donut tire wasn't on yet, but I had a feeling that the thing didn't want to hurt me. Still, I would have at least gotten in my truck if I could have. I couldn't, so I just looked at the thing. It stood there until the car was out of sight. Then it looked at me, and I could have sworn it was wondering if I needed help. We looked at each other and I said, "Thanks," even though I knew it couldn't hear me, and probably wouldn't understand me if it did hear me. I went back to putting my tire on, and by the time I finished, it was gone. I went over to where I'd seen it, just looking to see if I could find any tracks or anything. I smelled a little urine, but that was all. When I got to the next town, I decided to get lunch. The funeral wasn't until late afternoon, and if I got there early, I'd just have to listen to the same old stories I'd heard 100 times. I went to a little diner in Marshalltown and ordered an egg salad sandwich and apple pie. I asked the waitress if she'd heard of any Bigfoot sightings in the area. I wasn't sure if she thought I was crazy at first because she looked really surprised, but then she said, "Yeah, why?" I shrugged and said, "Just wondering." She stood with her hand on her hip. "Okay, fine. I think I saw him," I said. "Where?" she asked. "On 30, I said. "A few miles back." She asked, "Did you get a picture?" Idiot that I was, I hadn't even thought of that. I said, "No." She shook her head like she didn't believe me, or she thought I was an idiot. I continued on to Ames and went to the funeral. My cousin gave a speech about how funny his dad was. He used to claim that he played for the New York Giants, which was a lie, and loved to play pranks on people like putting a cup of water on the top of doorways. On the way home, I went by the spot where I'd seen Bigfoot. I pulled over and sat in the truck for a while to see if he'd come. He didn't, and it started to get dark, so I left. I thought I would tell you about my experience here since everybody else seems to think I'm making it up. I guess I was at the wrong place at the wrong time. I wouldn't have been if it wasn't for Dawn. I wouldn't even really call her my friend. I didn't have friends because my parents had turned me into such a neurotic person. She filled some gap where friends should have been. And she was the kind of person who was naturally always looking for trouble. And I was easy to manipulate. She came up to me one day when we were in high school and asked if I wanted to go smoke. I didn't. But the thought of not being alone at lunchtime was too irresistible, I guess. I'm sure she sensed I was easy prey since I had no boundaries. After that first joint, I just went along with whatever harebrained idea she had. I don't really know why she wanted me around. I guess having a sidekick can come in handy. She had a knack for finding out where the outsiders were hanging out, and we would hang there too. All the party houses in Cincinnati became our territory. She was determined to stay high as a kite the majority of the time. And she was obsessed about this 5-pound bag of pot she had left behind in Tucson, Arizona. Dawn and one of her friends had stolen it a while back. I don't know the details, but she had left it with her hairdresser friend who was hiding it in her freezer. I can't make this stuff up, even if everyone thinks I can. We had no way of getting to Tucson, so we started out hitchhiking. It was slow going and Dawn got frustrated and said we had to go to a truck stop. She said that was the way to find a long-distance ride. We found a driver who said he could take us as far as St. Louis, so we took him up on it. That sounded like a good long stretch. He said he had to make a drop-off somewhere in downtown St. Louis near the Arch, and then he could help us find a ride further west. Even though I thought Dawn was crazy, it was exciting to be on the road. I had never been west of the Mississippi, and it did give me a feeling of adventure. The trucker was telling us that he liked having company on the road because he was prone to getting white line fever. We didn't know what that was. He said when someone drives for too long, they can start staring at the white lines on the road and get hypnotized by them. It only happened when he was really tired, but the trucking lifestyle didn't include regular sleep hours. And sometimes he'd space out so much he wouldn't remember a whole stretch of road he'd driven. So having us along for the ride was helping him too. I had always wanted to do more traveling, even though that wasn't the way I had pictured it. When I was a kid, I would hear people at school always talking about the trips they had taken. The trucker said he had been all over the United States and had met a lot of interesting people. I was sitting by the window and looking out at the stars. It was really late. Dawn was talking the driver's ear off. She always had a lot to say. I guess that's just what he needed. I got really tired and just fell asleep. When I woke up, we were in some kind of warehouse area. Dawn was asleep beside me and someone outside of the truck was yelling. I looked out of the windshield and the truck driver was out there pointing up at something and just freaking out and saying, "Oh my God." I got out and went over to him and he's like, "It landed up there, up on the top." I didn't see anything. I started wondering if that white line fever thing he'd been talking about was affecting him. I was looking up and staring at the St. Louis Arch. It was beautiful. I had never seen such a thing. They had it all lit up at night and it was just glowing so brightly. The trucker was shouting, "We have to get somebody. That thing is huge." I did not know what he was talking about. The arch? The arch was huge. And then I saw something creeping down from the top. As soon as I saw it, I got the real heebie-jeebies. It was something unnatural. It was moving like an insect, but it was gigantic. It kept stopping every now and then and spreading out what looked like big black wings. It would shake them out and then fold them back up and come down a little farther. Since the arch was lit up, it was actually pretty easy to see it once you spotted it. At a certain point, it seemed to sense us watching it. It turned its head toward us, and I saw these glowing red eyes. It sounds crazy, but I know what I saw. By that time, the trucker was speechless, and we were both just staring at it. Then it let go of the arch and just seemed to start gliding through the air toward us. That red stare was really intense. Me and the trucker turned around and ran to the truck and locked the doors. He got that big truck turned around and out of there incredibly fast. He drove, and we didn't talk until we were all the way out of town. Dawn had finally woken up and was confused as hell. Me and the trucker were still shaking and trying to make sense of what we saw. There was no way to explain it. The creepiest thing ever. When I was in my last year of college, I got a placement at a hospital where I worked with professionals on the adolescent psych ward. The director and I would do crafts and projects with the teens to help them have an outlet while they were getting treatment. We dealt with a lot of mental illness and other medical issues. Every day before we'd see the teens, we'd get a rundown explaining who everyone was and what issues they were being hospitalized for. This one night we were given the usual report, and the nurse mentioned one teen in particular. This girl, who I'll call Joni, had all of a sudden just stopped talking and started to act really out of character. She wouldn't respond to family, friends, doctors, or anyone. She was hospitalized because they became concerned about her harming herself, and they were trying to ensure she was being watched 24/7. They were worried that she was experiencing some type of psychosis. From what I was told, they had checked and ruled out a brain tumor and other possible physiological causes and found nothing abnormal. This was a very old hospital with dark hallways, poorly lit rooms, and the creepiest atmosphere I've ever experienced. It looked like a hospital you'd see in a horror movie. When I walked down the hallways, I remember always being scared something would jump out at me because there were a lot of blind spots because of its very old layout. Anyway, this night in particular, the director and I were getting things together for the residents in the kitchen room where we always did our activities. I was sitting close to Joni and tried to initiate a conversation, but she would just stare at me blankly. The director tried as well, and Joni would not respond. Every now and then she would just look at us and laugh loudly or smile at me with glassy eyes. The doctors had tried all day to get her to speak, and she had said nothing, so I just chatted and tried my best to include her, even though she wouldn't really engage. I started to doodle on a piece of paper while talking with some of the other teens. On my paper, I just randomly wrote down "hi" and drew a design around it, not even really thinking about what I was doing. Almost immediately after I wrote "hi," Joni picked up a pencil and wrote "hello." I was shocked to say the least. I was the first person in days that she attempted to communicate with. I didn't know if it would work, but I wrote "how are you?" and she actually wrote an answer. I was blown away. We exchanged a couple questions and answers. Within a few minutes, this girl and I had written almost a page of conversation, and she was communicating through writing with no trouble. I couldn't believe it was happening. I was getting all this info from a girl that everyone thought was unreachable. We communicated through writing for what seemed like hours, but was probably just about 1 hour. While I was asking her how she was feeling about being in the ward, she admitted through writing that she was scared. I kept going, trying to see if she was scared because she was in a strange place or missed her family or what. But she wrote that it was because she saw people in the room with us. Obviously, there were people in the room with us, so I asked why the people in the room scared her. She wrote, "because they are dead." I swear, when I read that, it felt like my stomach hit the floor. I looked up from the page we were writing on, and she just looked at me and then turned her head and stared at the door. No one was there. I mean, I didn't see anyone there. Joni stared at that door for at least a minute, and I swear she saw something there. I was more freaked out than I can even express. I'll never forget the look on her face. Whether or not there was something there, Joni could definitely see someone. I tried to relax, and once I got her attention back, we started communicating again through writing. We talked this way until 9 p.m., when my shift was over. She said that the dead people kept their distance from her when other people were around. But when she was in bed at night, they surrounded her and warned her not to ever speak or they'd take her away. When I was leaving, I thanked Joni for speaking to me. I collected the papers we had written on, and I showed the entire conversation to the director and the nurse in charge. Everyone on duty was freaked out by what it said. They assured me that the pages would be passed along to the psychiatrist the next morning. I was filled with so many emotions. I was happy I had spoken to her, and she was honest with me, but I was really scared and shaken up. I got home, and I remember walking into the living room, and my roommates knew right away something was wrong. I was shaking and blurted out everything that happened. They were supportive but also freaked out by the situation. I've never been happier to have roommates. If I'd gone home to an empty place, I probably wouldn't have slept at all. Sadly, because of the schedule I had and all the different shift changes at the hospital, I never saw Joni again and never found out what the final diagnosis was for her. I still get the chills when I think about the look on her face that night when she stared at the door. I don't think I will ever shake that feeling. I just hope she got the help she needed. I worked at a national park for a few years in the American Southwest. I don't want to say the name of the park on here, but it's a pretty famous one. There's no way you haven't heard of it. I worked at one of the many information stations we have around the park. Mostly it involved handing out maps, explaining trails, and checking in guests for guided tours. Sometimes I got to give small tours and host educational talks about the history of the area and our local wildlife. We tended to hire quite a few seasonal staff during the busy season to keep things running smoothly. We didn't have as many visitors in the winter, so we could run on a skeleton staff. Typically, the trails get some snow in December, January, and February. It's not usually much, but it's enough to make the trails icy and extremely dangerous. The unfortunate part about working the winter season with a skeleton crew was that we all had to do a bit of everything. One day I had been tasked to restock the cafeteria display in the main lodge. We don't offer room services or meals like a hotel, but we do have a cafeteria where our guests can purchase pre-made food. I would have to get up at 4 a.m. to have the display stocked before it opened. Now, I'm not much of a morning person, so I asked my supervisor if I could do it that night instead. I had keys to the building and planned to go there after everything was shut down for the day. My supervisor was one of the lead rangers at the park. He said he didn't care when I got the cafeteria done, just that it was done before 6 a.m. I took this to mean he knew I would be doing it at night, but judging by what happened later that night, he definitely forgot I was going to be there. I'll admit, I did start quite a bit later than I had planned. It was nearly 11 at night by the time I started restocking. I know that sounds pretty late, but I'm a night owl, and it was sort of nice to be able to work without anyone else there. I was only about 20 minutes into my task when I heard the cafeteria door open. I was in the back of the kitchen, but it was a heavy door, and there was no mistaking it. I knew only someone with a set of keys could be in here, so I knew it was one of my co-workers. I was about to check who it was when I heard my supervisor's voice. It sounded like he was talking on the phone. I heard him walk to the counter and grab something. It sounded like a yogurt cup, but that's not really important. I was still behind the kitchen door, but he was close enough that I could hear his half of the phone conversation. It might be important for me to say that the cafeteria lights are always on at the front counter, even through the night. So he truly had no idea I was back there. I thought I should probably just walk out with an armful of food for the counter so he would know he wasn't alone, but then they started talking about some strange things, so I stayed back. They were talking about footprints on one of the main trails in the canyon. Bare footprints. As in without shoes. In December. There was a light dusting of snow on the ground, so any strange footprints should have been easy to follow. I know there are some crazy hikers out there, but no way is someone hiking without shoes in this type of weather. At this point, I'm thinking they are talking about a missing hiker, but we hadn't had any reports of missing hikers lately. But then my supervisor said something odd. He said, "It's best to leave it well enough alone. It doesn't want to harm anyone." That was the word that stuck out to me. He wouldn't have described an animal as being barefoot, and he wouldn't have called a person it. I didn't know what to think. I scooted closer to the kitchen door so I could hear better. The conversation sounded tense. They weren't arguing, but they were close to it. My supervisor told the other person that their services weren't needed and that no one has had a negative encounter with the creature yet. Things got a little heated and I couldn't hear everything that was said, but I do remember exactly what my supervisor said before he hung up the phone. He said, "If you want to hunt it, go ahead. But you'll never find it, even with a fresh trail. A lot of people have tried." I waited until I heard the front door open and close before I stuck my head out of the kitchen. I definitely wasn't supposed to hear that conversation, but I had to know what they were talking about. However, I was left with more questions than answers. I wasn't able to put the story together until the following day at lunch when I was talking to one of my co-workers who had been working the morning shift in the cafeteria. She told me that a hiker had stopped and talked to her a little bit. He was heading out a couple of days early because of the trail conditions. He tried to hike into the canyon but had to turn back, and on his route back, he saw some footprints in the snow. Bare human footprints. He said he reported it to the ranger station and called the non-emergency police line to ask if there were any reports of missing people in the area because the rangers weren't taking him seriously. He asked my coworker if she heard of anyone who had gone missing. The hiker was convinced that there was someone out there wandering around the canyon without shoes. I didn't know what to think. I still don't know what to think. I haven't seen any strange creatures in the park myself, but from the little bits of information I overheard, I don't think these things want to be seen. I couldn't tell you what they look like, just that they have human feet, and according to my supervisor, they don't pose a threat to people. But I do know there is something out there. I work at the restaurant on West Country Road in Merrill, Wisconsin, and I don't want to mention any names, but it's just like they say, we're open late. So I'm like the low guy on the totem pole here, and I always get stuck closing up with this kid who's as lazy as all, but I need to keep this job so I don't complain. If he doesn't do it, I got to do it, but like I said, I'm not going to complain to my manager. I really wanted to get home that night because some days I've just had it, And here it is after 3 a.m, and I'm still mopping up the floor while the other guy keeps going into the bathroom to avoid doing any work. So I grab the trash and haul it outside, even though I have done everything on my list. I got out to the dumpster, which is kind of in a shed with 3 sides, and I come around the corner and I see this thing scoot back behind the dumpster. I thought it might be a homeless guy or something because it's so late, so I just yelled, "Hey, by the way, I don't have a problem with anyone living on the street, but he needed to get out of there." Nobody answers me, so I stop because I've got to unlock the padlock and I can't see who's back there. For all I know, it's someone who's going to mug me. I didn't know what to do, so I just yelled, "I'm calling the cops." And then I hear a growl, really loud and mean-sounding, but it was so strange because I saw a person walk behind there. But maybe I was wrong because now it sounds like a big dog, that low growl they have. So I did something kind of stupid then. I just picked up a rock and threw it at the dumpster, thinking the noise on the metal would scare it off. But instead, the thing rushes out straight at me, and sweet Jesus, I never seen nothing like that thing before. It was on 2 legs like a man and bigger than me, but it looked like a dog's head on it with a muzzle and everything. And I could see teeth because it was snarling. I just dropped the bag of trash and ran for the door because my mind couldn't understand what the thing was, but I knew it was going to eat me. I got to the door, and that loser Stan had locked the lock because that's the policy here, after hours. You lock it, even if you're going out for just a minute. So I've got the key in my hand, but I'm shaking so bad I can't get it in the lock, and I can't see Stan nowhere. I looked over my shoulder, and thank God that thing must have gone after the trash bag instead, because it wasn't behind me. I managed to get the key in the lock and got inside and locked it. I'm breathing so hard I thought I'd have a heart attack. I told Stan there was this weird creature like a werewolf out there, and he laughed at me. Of course, I guess I would have laughed if he told me that. But I can tell you right now, the thing was real. It was all covered with dog fur or wolf fur and had a big head like a dog and stand-up ears. I didn't get a good look at its paws, but its eyes were yellow and it had these big teeth. It was definitely walking on two legs because it came at me that way. I don't know about a tail. We left like 15 minutes later, but I wasn't parked near the dumpster, so I just hurried over to my car and got in and locked the doors. I cruised by on the road to the other side where you can see the dumpster, but the thing was gone. Or hiding behind it, maybe. I even told my manager about it because I don't want to work the closing shift no more, and he thought I was making it up. So the only thing I can think is maybe go over there some night when I'm not working and sit in my car facing the dumpster building with my camera ready. I figure I need a picture for anyone to take me seriously, and who knows, I might even be able to sell a picture like that to a magazine or something. I didn't believe in ghosts until I started working in this cafe near Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. The cafe's gone now, and I'll get to that later. I basically got a job there because I was going to school at OSU and it was right by campus. It was a little dingy place in a basement, basically, like you had to walk downstairs from street level to get there. It had a few tables and a little dining room and another room that had a small stage where local bands sometimes played. I didn't usually hear them because I worked in the really early morning. It opened at 6 and I had to get there at 5 to brew coffee and bake muffins. When I first started, I worked with this guy named Brad. He talked all the time about his girlfriend or his lack of a girlfriend, his classes at OSU, his roommate, everything. One day, though, he got sick and didn't come in. It was quiet in there without him, at least when I was opening the restaurant before any customers showed up. After a few minutes, I noticed noises. It sounded exactly like when Brad was there, except without the talking. Drawers opening and closing, the squeak the oven door makes, footsteps on the floor, banging like someone doing dishes in the sink. But when I looked around, of course, no one was there. Once people started to come in, I didn't notice anymore and forgot. The next day, Brad still hadn't gotten better, and it happened again. When I was making coffee, I heard someone walking around. A wooden spoon banging against the side of a bowl, the cooler door opening and closing. After I finished setting up the sandwich station, I heard the oven timer go off. I was sure I hadn't set the timer or put anything in the oven. I'd been planning to bake the muffins a little later. As I walked over to the oven, I felt a chilly place in the room. It was weird because it wasn't close to the air conditioning vent, and the AC wasn't on anyway since it was October. There really aren't any windows in the place either since it's the basement, so I couldn't think of anywhere the cold could be coming from except the walk-in cooler. I looked over at it and the door was closed. When I got closer to the oven, I noticed the smell of muffins. I opened it, and sure enough, there were muffins inside. Done perfectly. I took out the pan, trying to convince myself that I must have somehow made them without remembering. But I wasn't that tired. I was used to getting up at 4:30. I was sure I hadn't made the muffins, but then who had? Could someone have snuck in and made them while my back was turned? I couldn't make myself believe that. I knew I'd turned around a few times because I'd heard something. I would have seen the person unless they were invisible. What could I do? I kept getting ready for breakfast service and tried to tell myself nothing was wrong. As the day went on, I tried to be aware of any extra noises in the kitchen, but it was too hard with all the customers. Finally, right before my shift ended, it did get quiet for a while, but I didn't hear anything. I asked Samantha, who had the late shift, if she'd ever heard anything strange in the kitchen, and she looked at me like I was crazy, so I took that for a no. Brad still wasn't back the next day, and I was nervous but also kind of curious. I decided to see what would happen if I made the muffins, set up the sandwich station, and didn't make the coffee. I tried that, pretending I'd forgotten the coffee. I heard the noises, the footsteps, and dish banging like usual. I was about to give up and do the coffee when I looked over and it was done. 3 fresh pots of coffee sat on the dining room burners. See, the cafe offers bottomless serve-yourself coffee, so we have 3 pots that just sit there all day, and we make more whenever they run out. The machine is in the back, near the walk-in cooler, so I couldn't see it from the prep table and stove. But still, I would have noticed someone walking by me to bring the pots out to the dining room. It was weird, but not really scary, I guess. I started to think of the ghost as just another cafe worker, just one I couldn't see. After that, I didn't leave tasks for the ghost, but they got done anyway. Dishes in the sink appeared clean on the draining board. Muffins were made or placed in the display case. I even noticed a pot of coffee appear a few times during the day when we ran out. It was maybe a week before Brad returned. "Bet you missed me," he said. "Did you have trouble getting everything done while I was gone?" "I had help," I told him. "Have you heard any weird stories about this place?" "What do you mean?" he asked. I shrugged, thinking maybe he didn't know anything. "Well, there was this girl one time. She worked here like 10 years ago, I heard. Customers came one morning and she hadn't opened the cafe. When the next shift worker showed up, they found her dead by the cooler," he said. "What happened?" I asked, feeling a little chill run up my spine. "No one knows," he said. "Why you ask?" "No reason," I said. I decided to keep it to myself. At least until now, me telling you. I worked there for another year or so, and then I got a job on campus. Around the time I graduated, they tore down that whole strip of buildings. I wonder what happened to the ghost. Where do they go when the place they're haunting goes away? I live in Florida now, but I used to own a campground near Grand Lake, Colorado. Grand Lake's a glacier lake, so it's cold. You can't really swim in it, even in the summer. But tourists come to go on boat rides around it because it's scenic, or to hike. So my campground was outside of town on a dirt road. We had 30 RV hookups, 10 campsites for tents, and 11 cabins. Also showers, laundry room, and office. I lived in a little apartment above the laundry, and it was great, really. Hired a few people to help out. Townies and a few transient types who'd head down south or to the ski resorts for winter work. But then, one day, this guy comes in the office with a photo on his phone. He was staying at the farthest RV spot from the office. I can't remember, but he had some kind of camper trailer, maybe even an old pop-up. He was staying in with his girlfriend. Older guy, 60-ish. I figured he was retired, but I didn't think about it too much. Lots of people come and go, and most don't stay more than a week. This guy had been there a couple days, I think. I'd been working on payroll for the week, worrying as usual about whether I had too many people on staff and how I was going to make it through the winter. From November to April, I catch a few odd jobs in town, like driving one of the county snowplows, but it's never easy. When this guy walked in, I felt a cold breeze. Maybe not a breeze, more like a little freeze in my gut. Made no sense because when he checked in, the dude was friendly enough, talking about the weather, hiking, photography. That was his hobby. I figured he just wanted to complain that the washer ate his quarters, something like that. So I smiled and said hi, and he said, "I got something to show you." He had a laptop computer under his arm, and he put it on the counter, opened it up, and a photo filled the screen. It was dark. I had no idea what I was looking at. "You see those red eyes?" he said. I looked closer, and maybe I saw 2 red dots off to the side of the blurry trees. I guess they were. "Maybe," I said. "Wish I could have got a better shot," he said. "That there's a Mothman, I'm sure of it." So he started to tell this story about how he got up early wanting to walk down to the overlook to get a photo of the sunrise. He heard something like huge wings flapping and turned around. Through the trees he saw this man-shaped thing, only it had huge wings and no face. Like where the face should have been, there was nothing except these red eyes. He grabbed the camera from around his neck and got off a shot at it just before it flew off into the sky. He wanted to try for another picture, but the sky was so dark that he knew he wouldn't get anything. "Wish I'd thought to take a video," he said. "The sound of those wings would have picked up on the mic for sure." I didn't really believe him. I'd never even heard of Mothmen before. I figured he'd just seen a hawk or something. Lots of them out there. The next day, he and his girlfriend took off, and I pretty much forgot about it. A couple of weeks later, though, things got weird. People would come and set up and leave the next day. They never said why, they'd just break their reservations and go. We were losing so much money that I was sure I'd never have enough for winter. Even the employees started quitting. Finally, after a couple weeks of this, I cornered Jimmy, who runs the laundry and shower rooms, cleans, collects the quarters, fills the machines, all that. "They're scared of Mothmen," he said. "Oh, come on," I said. "That's crazy." He showed me a picture on his phone, but it just looked like grainy blackness. He told me he wasn't scared because he'd gotten a special hoodoo bag to ward away spirits, so it stayed away from him. The photo, he said, was from Bob, who used to cut the grass at the campground. Bob quit the week before. I wasn't scared of Mothmen, but I was scared I'd never make any money off the place again. Then one couple came with a small tent, and I gave them the farthest campsite near the pond. On the day they were supposed to leave, Jimmy found all their things still there, but they were gone. We waited a day, and they still hadn't returned. We called the county sheriff, and he took the stuff for evidence. No sign of them. Before we let anyone else have that site, I went out and looked at it. The sheriff guys had tromped all over it. But off near the woods, I saw some weird markings in the dirt. They were in a kind of line like tracks, but claw-like sort of. I looked up what moths' feet look like, and they could have been big moth feet. I don't know, I wasn't really sure. Anyway, I was tired of not knowing what was going on, so one day I got up really early and went to the edge of the campground where it meets the woods and just stood there looking for a while. You know how your eyes take a while to get used to the dark, and when they do, you slowly start to see more. That happened, and then I saw something standing there at the edge of the woods. It was pretty far away, but I saw the red eyes. There was a huge, loud flapping sound, and then the thing was gone. That's when I decided to sell the campground and move to Florida. I live in Oklahoma City, but my family's got a couple of mobile homes down in Broken Bow. I go see them whenever I have a long weekend or something, and one Friday I had Monday off for a holiday, so I was getting my stuff together. Anyway, I live in a little 6-unit apartment complex, 3 units on the top floor and 3 on the bottom. Mine's the corner of the bottom. When you go out the door, there's a concrete slab that runs the length of it, and we put out plastic chairs or plants on it. I wanted to get going early, so I walked out of my apartment before the sun rose, carrying my duffel over my shoulder. There are a few lights on the outside of our building, but some of them are always burned out. That day, the one in front of my neighbor's place, the guy in the middle, his was out. But in the dimness of the not-so-bright bulb in front of the next unit, I saw something hunkered down near the door. It looked like a smallish person, but naked. Skinny, too. I could see the rib cage through this creepy pale skin. Its mouth was open and looked like a big old hole. The more I looked, the less human it seemed. The eyes were black like they were holes too, and it had no expression. It just stared at me, and then I heard this clicking nose. Weird, like maybe someone squeezing one of those dog clickers over and over. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and then I figured out this thing was making the noise. Maybe with its mouth, but I really couldn't tell. I yelled, "Hey, what are you doing?" I was trying to not sound scared, but it didn't really work. At least I was loud, though. The thing kind of flinched and started to back away from the door. It was still hunched down and like crawling on all fours. "Go away," I said. I wanted to run, but I was afraid it could get in the neighbor's door, and I didn't want it to do that. I didn't know what it would do if it did get in there, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be anything good. 1 second it was backing away, and the next it was gone. That thing was fast. I got in my car and ripped out of that parking lot quick. When I got to my brother's trailer in Broken Bow, it was mid-morning and he was out feeding the chickens. He asked me what the heck was wrong with me because he could see I was shaken up. Our family's part Choctaw and they do believe in some weird stuff, so I wasn't surprised that after I told him what I saw, he said, "The rake." "It was hanging around your apartment?" he said. "That's bad." "Yeah, why?" I said, trying to act not scared again. "You got to talk to Gamma," he said. I didn't want to tell our grandma about it, but I guessed he was right. Once he was done feeding the chickens, we went off to her trailer just down the road. Gamma lives with another old lady, and they spend most of their time making beaded stuff for tourists. They were sitting out from their trailer shelling peas when we got there. "Gamma, I seen the rake," I said. Her old lady friend Patty dropped the pea she was shelling and then picked it back up and tossed it in the plastic tub. "You got a dream catcher in your room?" Gamma asked me. "No, I don't got one of them tourist things," I said. "Why would I?" "Welp, you need one," she said and shoved her pea basket toward Patty. We went inside and she started getting stuff out of her stash of craft stuff. I couldn't believe I was even doing this. Seemed pretty silly, but then that rake was one scary thing, so I went along with it since I didn't know how else to keep it away. "Where you seen it?" she asked while she strung string and beads on a wooden circle. "Outside my apartment," I said. "Actually, my neighbor's apartment." She looked at me and said, "They need one too." "What about the other units?" I asked. "How many?" she said. I told her and she said, "Get to work." I'm no craft person, but by the time we finished all 6 of the dream catchers, I was getting pretty good at it. She put them in a bag and said, "Go bring them home." "Wait, I was going to stay the weekend," I said. She gave me her look, and you don't argue with Gamma's look. I took the bag and left. I felt pretty silly, but I knocked on everyone's door and handed out the dream catchers. Told them to hang it over their beds like Gamma said. They looked at me weird, but took them, all except Steve on the top floor. He didn't answer. I knew he was there because his little sedan was in the lot. Plus, I could see a light on. I left the dream catcher by the door. Maybe it would still work there. I went into my apartment and hung mine over the bed, but I sure didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about that creepy rake hanging around outside the building. Over the next few days, Steve's car didn't move. Normally, he goes to work in the morning and comes back around 6, but it just sat there. After a week, I saw his door was open and the landlord was there. I asked him what happened, and he said Steve split. Left all his stuff. I didn't see the dream catcher anywhere. Personally, I think the rake got him. I'm leaving that dream catcher over my bed. It had been a long day, and a particularly weird one at that. Things at work kept seemingly disappearing and then showing up in odd places. My computer screen kept flickering on and off, and twice I lost work before I could save it. The last thing of the day was an electric pencil sharpener not working for me. On top of that, I just felt drained. My energy level was just non-existent all day, in fact, all week. I would wake up in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but there was this feeling I kept having. I can't really explain it. I know that sounds odd, but I just can't bring it to words. Maybe dread was the closest I could relate it to. Maybe that's too cliché, I don't know. People had begun to notice how tired I looked. Dark rings around my eyes that were more often than not bloodshot. I'd forget things, lose my temper at odd times. I was a mess, really. After work, I came home and just dropped onto the couch. I didn't have any energy to do anything, really. I turned on the TV and flipped through the channels. I didn't even have energy for that. I just left it on something and then I began to drift off, I guess. I don't remember. That's when it happened. I was just lying on the couch. I remember opening my eyes and feeling strange all of a sudden. My arms had goosebumps and I had a feeling of slight panic. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. I can't really explain why. My body just wouldn't move for me. Suddenly it felt like there were hands on my shoulders and something was holding me down. I tried to move. I remember I kicked my legs a little, but this force just held me down. It felt like fingers digging into my shoulders, and I couldn't catch my breath. I swore for a second I saw the outline of a face, not details or anything, just the faint outline of a face's features. Deep sunk eyes, sunken cheeks, a mouth open wide like it was inhaling something over me. I couldn't catch my breath. I started to really panic, and that made me move more. I started moving my shoulders, my arms, trying to push whatever it was that was on top of me. I could feel it holding me, but I couldn't feel it when I kicked up towards where it should be. Suddenly it let go of me, and I jump up off the couch. The door to the room slammed shut, and I can't explain it, but then I felt alone. I was covered in a cold sweat, and I was feeling dizzy. I started to walk towards the kitchen when the TV suddenly shut off, then on again, the volume turning up higher and higher. I covered my ears with my hands and tried desperately to turn it down with the remote. The TV turned off, and it felt like something knocked me over. I fell to the floor, and I could swear something jumped on top of me, pinning me down. I had this huge pressure on my chest. I couldn't breathe. I tried to get up to call out, but I couldn't. The room began to spin, and then everything went dark. I woke up 3 hours later. I got my keys and ran out the door to my car. I didn't know what else to do, so I drove to the hospital. Apparently, I looked pretty bad because they took me in immediately and hooked me up to fluids and had me in a bed. 3 bags of saline and 48 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and I could feel somewhat normal again. The doctors and nurses asked me what had happened to me. What could I tell them? I didn't know what to say. After hours of not saying anything, that's when they had the psychiatrist come in. My story came to me immediately when that happened. It was work. I wasn't sleeping. I was overworking myself. I was consuming too much caffeine. I tried to make it sound as normal as possible. I don't know if the doctor believed me or not. They kept me for another 3 days. When I was released, it took me a long time to go home. I drove around for a while, went to a restaurant to eat, but eventually I made my way home. I sat in my driveway, my hands clenched the steering wheel, and I saw something in my house. I saw it move past the curtains, a dark silhouette that suddenly dropped out of sight. I tried to take a picture, but nothing came out on my camera phone. I left right after that. I drove 12 hours to my parents' house in Tennessee. I didn't know what else to do. I told them everything, the whole story, and prayed I didn't sound like a crazy person. I must have, though. I don't know what my father thought. My mother seemed to believe me, and I stayed at my parents' house for a few weeks. That was that I was moving immediately. I don't know what happened, but I wasn't staying in that house. As soon as I could, I had it up for sale and got my stuff out as fast as possible. We did it during the day and as fast as humanly possible. I spent as little time as possible in that house. Things happened to the movers and my parents as well. Things would disappear in the house. The movers felt uncomfortable, but maybe that was because they kept seeing me. I'm sure I couldn't hide my fear as well as I should have. I moved back in with my parents after that, but I kept track of the house. Eventually, it went to a married couple. Months went by and nothing seemed to happen. I still have nightmares, still can't sleep at night. I don't know what happened. I can't explain it. Nothing like it has happened to me since. I hope it never does again. And I'm ready to tell you all about the time I ran into a Wendigo on the prairies of North Dakota. It was a nice September evening and the opening weekend of deer season, 2020, in Bottineau County. It had been a hard year and I'd looked forward to hunting for months, even bought myself a new deer stand in preparation for the hunt. It was the second day of the season, so according to North Dakota law, I was allowed to stay in my stand for half an hour after sunset. For years, it's been my usual routine to head out midday and set up my deer stand, then take the stand down just as dark starts creeping in. Years ago, my dad had taught me that the afternoon and evening were the best time to spot deer because they've come accustomed to the hustle and bustle of human life during the day and learned on their own to come out during the quiet parts of the evening when humans are usually scarce. I was pretty exhausted that particular morning. My cousin had for some reason planned her wedding for the same weekend, and I'd spend the night before tying one on with family and friends. When I climbed into the deer stand, I leaned back in my seat and yawned and stretched. I'd found a perfect quiet spot way out in the middle of an open acreage owned by a friend of the family who had given me permission to hunt the land. Off in the distance, I could hear the honking of Canada geese as they made their way south for the winter. Aside from them, I was completely alone out there. It was a perfectly clear and sunny afternoon and a comfortable high 60s in temperature. I had on my favorite jacket and a thermos of my grandma's hot cocoa to hold and enjoy, making the crisp and cool autumn air even more enjoyable. It's strange. When I first got up in that stand, I thought I was wide awake and ready for the hunt, even in spite of all the partying the night before. I didn't even realize I was falling asleep until I got woken up by the shaking of my deer stand. It was pitch black when I opened my eyes. I didn't know the time and was too panicked to check in the moment, but I'd later realize it was creeping up on midnight when I got woke up. I wasn't sure what was happening when I first got startled awake. It was clear that something was trying to shake me out of the tree, but I couldn't really place what it might be. There are no bears living in the area, and the musky smell of whatever it was far too strong to be that of a horse or a bull. I grabbed my flashlight from my jacket pocket and shone it down below me. Right away, I spotted a huge set of antlers. My thought was that it was a buck deer up on his hind legs trying to knock down the stand for some reason, but that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Deer are usually shy and skittish. There would be no reason for him to have suddenly attacked me as I slept. It wasn't all bad, though, because I had come out there to bag a buck, and there he was. I hesitated before reaching for my gun. It was well past nightfall and beyond the legal hunting hours, but I figured I had a pass to shoot this thing since it was actively trying to kill me, too. I pointed the barrel of the shotgun down right between the antlers and took aim, then pulled the trigger. It was only when the thing fell backwards did I realize that it was no normal deer. When it fell, I could tell that it wasn't built like a deer with a straight back and legs. Instead, it was almost cat-like in appearance with peaked shoulders and a thin waist. It shook its head at the feel of the bullet and then stood back up and looked at me. It stood on only the two back legs, like a human, and stared me right in the eyes. This thing was like nothing I'd ever seen before, but I knew right away what it was. The Wendigo is a popular figure in Native American folklore, and my dad's a member of the Lakota tribe. I knew from the stories that they can't be outrun, and they can't be shot with regular bullets. They regenerate faster than they bleed. Fortunately, they also can't climb. I made my way further up the tree and took shelter for the night. By sunrise, it had completely torn my new deer stand apart, but as the sun came up, it got bored enough to leave. I made my way down and gathered up the pieces of the stand and carried it back to my truck. I never told anyone what had happened with the stand to cause it so much damage. When I got home and my parents asked, I just shrugged it off and said it wasn't well built, but I think my dad might have known. The next time I went out, he handed me a cloth bag with silver bullets and told me to be careful. Apparently, once a Wendigo sets its sights on you, it doesn't give up. I'll never hunt without that bag in my kit again. As I learned, you never know when you might need them. I just left the strangest government job and I need to tell someone about this. 4 months ago, I got a job working on a government project. On the first day of work, about 50 other temp workers and I walked into a huge, empty warehouse. There were 6 men in suits sitting at a conference table with a projector aimed at the wall. We were told to gather around the conference table to have a meeting before getting to work. One of the guys in a suit stood up and gave a speech saying that from this day forth, We were heroes. He talked about the children's lives we would be saving by working hard and sending pallets of much-needed food to the places in the world that needed them the most. He went on and on about how every minute we waste is a children's life that could have been saved. He appeared to wipe a tear from his eye and leave the room. I'm pretty sure the tear wasn't sincere, but it set the mood for the rest of the 4 months. We all worked like animals, sending truckloads of pallets to the children in need. I worked as a forklift driver, and I didn't take a single break for the entirety of the time I worked. I would cram my lunch down in the middle of a bathroom break and get right back on the forklift and load pallets into the trucks to be sent off. The pay was pretty good for a temp job, but for a government job it seemed to be absolute chaos. If OSHA inspected our warehouse, they would have shut it down in minutes. We didn't wear any protective gear. We didn't have any breaks. We worked in a poorly ventilated warehouse without air conditioning in the middle of August. We didn't receive any training whatsoever. No food or water was provided. I could go on and on. Every night after my 12-hour shift, I would be so exhausted that I had trouble making the drive home safely. But the pay was good. About 3 weeks into the job, I got promoted to a management position. I was pumped because I got more pay, but I didn't know the first thing about how to manage an operation like that. The biggest perk was they brought in an air-conditioned trailer for me to do the paperwork in. The other workers looked at me with hate, but I couldn't complain. One day, a truck drove off the loading dock with a forklift driver still inside. The forklift fell off the back of the truck, and the pallet he was carrying crashed on top of him. I shut down the operation and checked on the forklift driver. He was in bad shape. He couldn't move because of the pain, and a bucket of chemicals that were in the pallet poured all over him and was burning his skin. As we were trying to help get him out of there, all 6 of the suited men ran out onto the parking lot. The one that did the presentation on the first day screamed at us for halting production. I explained to him that the forklift driver, we'll call him Peter, could have died and he needs immediate medical attention. The suited man had a breakdown that I was undermining his orders and was selfishly putting my friend's needs ahead of the poor children's needs. I was speechless. He screamed at everyone to get back to work, and they did. Peter died right then and there, and everyone just ignored him and kept working. The suited men pulled out rubber gloves and picked up Peter and took him into my trailer. They locked the door, and I didn't see them for the rest of the shift. We just closed the one dock where the forklift was blocking accessibility and continued working feverishly. I had never been in management before when there was an on-site injury, so I did some research and learned that the standard operating procedure is to fill out an employee's report of injury form. Thinking I was doing the right thing, I filled out all the information and printed it out to give to the suited man. The next day, I went to my trailer, and it was still locked. I knocked on the door, and immediately one of the men pushed me back and closed the door to the trailer. I handed him the form, and he immediately asked how many copies I made. I said just the one, and he asked which computer I used to make the form. I explained I used my home computer, and he immediately took me to his car and had me give instructions to my address. We pulled up to my house, and he followed me close behind as I went inside to grab the computer. He immediately grabbed my computer and threw it in the trunk of his car. I started yelling at him, and he gave me $2,000 in cash to get another one. My computer was only worth $300, so I took it. On the last day, I walked in, and the trailer was gone, and the warehouse was almost empty. The only thing in there was the conference table and the suited men. I walked up to them, and they handed me an envelope with my last paycheck in it. They said that the project was top secret, and I couldn't talk about anything that happened here. I agreed and wished them the best. I walked outside and opened the envelope. There was a $20,000 bonus in there and a note that said, "Silence." The temp agency has me working for a pest control company now, so things have settled down drastically in my life. I do often wonder what we were sending off by the truckload and whom we were sending them. It wasn't food for children like we were told. It was some sort of deadly chemical, and I don't know who was ordering so much of it. I also don't like the fact that those people know where I live. and I don't scare easy. Maybe that's my ego talking, but I like to think it's the truth. The military humbles you, but it also teaches you what you're capable of. It teaches when fear is and isn't appropriate. 3 weeks ago, my fear was very appropriate. Unless I dreamt the entire day, there's no explanation for what I saw. There's at least no explanation that makes sense. I've gone hunting every season since I retired from the military. That's 10 years now. Deer, boars, elk, I've been up and down the food chain. I eat what I kill. I'm not a trophy hunter. You might not know I was a hunter, as a matter of fact, if you just came by my place some random afternoon. I don't keep gun magazines on the coffee table. My gun closet is tucked away in the garage, safely away from the eyes and hands of visitors. I don't talk about hunting. It's my personal time, get it? Out there, away from civilization with a rifle in my hands, it can be a comforting feeling. For better or for worse, the experience is calming. Usually. 3 weeks ago, calm was thrown out the window. I had recently moved my deer tower from its usual spot in the Okanogan forest. I set it up about 30 kilometers northwest. My only motivation was the change in scenery. In hindsight, that might not have been a good enough reason. Something found me out there. Despite all the camouflage and concealment, something picked my scent off the wind and came right to me. It hunted me like a fox on a hen. I was sitting in my little hen house, all warm and unprepared. It expected me to be an easy meal, I'm sure. If I'd been any less lucky that day, I probably would have been. I didn't hear it coming. That's embarrassing, but I didn't. I only saw it when it breached the tree line and sulked into the clearing. It was massive. I thought at first that it was a bear. Its fur was just too long, too thick and wild. When I aimed my gun in its direction, I saw the beast for what it was. A wolf, I think. A wolf larger than any animal I've seen in North America. It was looking right at me. It was looking at me and drooling. Starving, I could tell. I was shocked. I was appropriately afraid, I think. My rifle was not the caliber designed to take out animals of that magnitude. It kept coming toward the deer tower. I slid my finger onto the trigger just in case I'd have to shoot to keep the beast moving. The base of my tower was 10 feet off the ground. When that thing got close and stood on its hind legs, its front claws scraped the corner of the floor. I shot it, and it didn't flinch. It roared and sighed, almost annoyed, and it mauled the tree tower itself. It could have jumped up there, I bet. It could have joined me in the box and had me cornered. I don't know why it didn't. Maybe it was just playing with me. Maybe I made it angry and it wanted to piss me off right back. It tore through the legs in seconds. The next thing I knew, the entire structure was collapsing. The floor fell from beneath my feet and I went tumbling with it. I hit the ground hard, lost my breath. Most of the tower collapsed right on top of the wolf or the dog or the bear. I still don't know what it was, do I? The weight of the tower knocked it down, disoriented it. The bottle of doe urine I had with me busted open. The scent must have hit that animal like a whirlwind. It thrashed at the splintered remains of the stand and gave me just enough time to run. I made it into the tree line with my rifle in hand. I knew I couldn't outrun it. It was only a matter of time before it landed on my scent yet again. I turned around and used the side of a tree to steady my aim. I was still pretty shaken from the fall. I waited. I held my breath and I waited. I watched the wolf thing rake its claws through the earth, searching for the source of the burning odor. When its paws came up empty, it started to look around. I watched as it stood up again and realized a horrifying truth. Its body sat just as naturally upright as it did on all fours. It didn't struggle to hold its balance at all. It spotted me again. It huffed and it stepped toward me, this time walking on 2 legs. Luck found me again at that moment. If the wolf hadn't stood up, I would have been aiming at its shoulders and its back. On its hind legs, though, I could get to its stomach. I could get to somewhere important. When I fired this time, it yelped. I screamed with every ounce of air in my lung. I screamed until I was empty. It must have been enough. I watched the wolf turn around and flee in the other direction. I waited again. I knew I had to. I had to make sure that it wasn't circling around me, trying to approach from the flank. It took me 10 hours to make it back to my car. Every sound and movement put me on edge. I don't scare easy. I didn't used to, anyway. The more time that passes between that encounter and now, the more I want to know what that animal was. I'll tell you one thing, though. I'm not willing to go back to get those answers. I'm built for a lot of things, but hunting isn't one of them. I will take my rifle anywhere else in the world, but that monster can have Okanogan. I don't look for trouble or drama, you know what I mean? When I got my new truck camper rig set up, I just wanted to get into the woods and soak up the peace and quiet, especially considering all the freaking problems I had to work out to get the whole thing up and running. My first trip was heading out west to the Umpqua National Forest to get some relief from this insane heat we've been having. I got to know this guy on the internet who was always talking about these incredible crystals he was finding. They were unbelievable, stuff you'd see at gem shows for serious money. He was digging them out of the earth. Me and my brother were always rock hounding when we were kids. I love how you can find spectacular things for free if you know where to look. It took me a couple of 10-hour driving days, but me and my dog, Jack, made it to Grants Pass, Oregon, and got a hold of Patrick. You know, the internet guy. He was going to get me set up with a boondocking spot near Myrtle Creek, about an hour up north. We met up at the diner there for a coffee. Patrick looked like some kind of forest sprite with his green eyes and intense stare. He was shy and seemed out of place in town. He told me he knew places in the woods that most people were unaware of, because of his hobby of planting baby fir trees. He really got into the thick of things out there. He was driving this beat-up station wagon with the back half of the roof caved in. I followed him out of town until we accessed this creekside dirt road. Then we just kept heading west until we were surrounded by these enormous trees everywhere. I'm telling you, they were enormous, and it was like nothing had ever been there till we arrived. And besides the sound of the river, it was dead silent. You'd think with all those trees you would hear a bird or two. Not one bird sound did I hear. Patrick showed me a spot of level ground where I could park the camper and get settled in. He took a tool roll out of the back of the station wagon and unrolled it on the ground. There were hammers and chisels and safety goggles and headlamps and other things in there. He seemed to know what he was doing. He pulled 2 hooded black vinyl ponchos out of his backpack and whispered that I should put one on. That seemed weird to me. There wasn't any rain, but he whispered that it would keep us more concealed. I didn't understand, but I didn't argue. It was so shadowy and quiet, I already felt concealed from everything. But something about that place wouldn't even let you speak out loud. He was going to take me to one of his favorite spots upstream in exchange for me helping him list and sell his findings. I got Jack leashed up and ready to go, and then Patrick said it wasn't safe to bring the dog. Not safe? What did that mean? It was strange, but it was like Patrick was someone you didn't question. Like, why are we wearing ponchos? Why can't the dog come? Why is your car bashed in? I staked Jack out on his leash and we headed into the brush beside the river. Once you got in there, you could see a faint path. It was evening and I was kind of hungry and feeling grungy and sticky from sweating through my last 2 days of driving. But I knew Patrick had limited time, and this was really a rare opportunity to have such an experienced guide. The stream was really rushing along, but then we came to this spot where it widened out and partially flowed into a shallow cave. Patrick pointed at the cave like that's where we were supposed to go. We put on the headlamps and headed into the cave. It stank. It smelled like an unwashed human had been living there for weeks. But obviously we were off the beaten path of indigent camps. When Patrick started digging at the water's edge right away, he started uncovering these gorgeous crystals. I was stunned. How could something like that be so close to the surface? I dug in and felt like I was in a dream with these perfect specimens I was unearthing. The beauty and the odor really did not go together. I was immersed in my search. It was so dark and quiet. Then crash! Into the mouth of the cave burst Jack. He was yelping and howling and tearing at my poncho like he was possessed. He looked like a cat with his hair all standing on end. He dragged and dragged at me, pulling me toward the cave's opening, and then I heard the most unearthly whooping sound, and the stench became truly unbearable. Rocks started raining down at the opening of the cave. Jack was wild-eyed. All I could do was succumb to his pulling me outside. It was chaos everywhere, rocks and water and mud and howling, and suddenly my vision was filled by a brown, hairy mass of 10-foot-tall humanoid creature. It howled and swiped at me, and I ran. I just followed Jack blindly out of that hell pit and didn't stop until I got us both into the truck and locked the doors. Patrick followed shortly and slammed himself into his car and took off. I was stunned. Barreling out of those woods, I was unable to make sense of anything. My 30-pound dog had ripped his stake out of the ground to come find me and save me from what? Later on, I was reading about Bigfoot sightings in that area and wishing I had known that sooner. Some people even said they had used pheromones to tempt him out of hiding. I'm sure I was emitting some pretty ripe emanations that day after my lack of showering. But holy cow, I have no words. I am not looking for trouble. I never believed in the supernatural. Maybe that's why it's so hard for me to square away what I saw in 2006. It's like a black stain on my perfect portrait of faith. It's something I can't explain. I hope that you can. If not, maybe you can point me towards someone with a theory. All of my theories have run their course. Do you remember 2006? An ice storm came through central Illinois that shattered trees and encased entire houses. We had to chisel our way out the front door. The way I remember it, we got hit at the tail end of November or the first week of December. It's hard to say. Either way, for the next month, we were in a purgatory of ice. Then we got hit again in January. That one I'm sure you remember, since it wasn't exclusive to any one state. Most of North America felt that one. For a while there, it seemed winter wasn't going to end. Global warming had really come for us, didn't it? The ice melted, and we went back to our usual lives, forgetting that more than 70 people were killed by that ice. Is 70 a lot? It feels like a lot. Either way, this story isn't about those 70 people. Maybe it should be. I know we've had storms just as bad since then, and it never feels like the country is really prepared. I don't want to get into politics, though. I don't want to talk about how much of our taxes go toward crisis spending, and I definitely don't want to debate the existence of global warming. I don't drink myself to sleep every night trying to forget that the ice caps are melting. I'm trying to forget what I saw. We had a few weeks to prepare, right? A few weeks when we all talked about the weatherman and doubted that his predictions of record-setting low temperatures would come true. We doubted him, but we emptied the stores anyways. We all do a bit of panic shopping, don't we? We hear we might be stuck indoors, and suddenly all we can think of is hoarding as many resources as we can. Stock the cupboards, fill the fridge, stack the cans in the basement. It was right after Thanksgiving. I remember because I was looking in the fridge, trying to decide whether or not my leftovers would carry me through the storm that was coming. I decided to grab a few groceries in the middle of the night just to be safe. I didn't count on the main roads being closed. I didn't count on the detour keeping me out so late. I certainly didn't think the storm would arrive while I was behind the wheel. It did. I ended up parked on the side of the road. My hazard lights reflected in the falling snow and ice, illuminating the area around me one beat at a time. Each time the light blinked on and unveiled the world around me, the road and the fields were covered by more freezing white. I was being buried. Luckily, by then I had grabbed my groceries. I zipped up my jacket and worked my way through a candy bar. It turns out stress eating can't save you from a blizzard. I started the car to run the heat and recharge the battery. As the engine hummed back to life, my hazard lights briefly stopped blinking. There was a pause in the rhythm. It was brief, only lasted for a single moment while the car fired up and remembered all of its responsibilities. But in that brief moment, before the hazards and the headlights could shine, another light blinked back at me. I cut the engine immediately. I pressed the triangular button that toggled my emergency lights and held my breath. Whatever blinked at me, it came from the sky. Helicopter? Not in that weather. I rubbed my eyes and took a deep breath, telling myself that the stress was overwhelming me. All the shadows from the storm had caught me by surprise. When I looked back through the windshield, the light blinked again. This time it was closer. This time I saw where it was coming from. A disc, easily the diameter of a train car, was floating above the road. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. The wind and the snow and the ice didn't seem to touch it. The smooth black surface was unmarked by the winter. From my position on the road, I could only make out a single obstruction on its polished circular frame. There was a large indentation, also circular, facing my direction. It felt like I was looking at the hollow socket of a skull. It felt like there was an eye there, something watching me that I couldn't see. The light blinked again, shining from that indentation and blanketing my car. It swallowed the vehicle, blinded me. I felt the frame rumble and grabbed my steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Something lurched underneath me, like the car was being lifted from the ground. I swayed in the mean winter wind. Then I fell. I worked as a janitor at a high school in Atlanta, Georgia, and there was a small graveyard across the street. I thought it looked pretty old. I never bothered to go look at the gravestones until I had a reason to. For the first month, it was a normal job. I come in around 3 after school's done for the day and clean until 8 or so whenever I finish up. It's pretty boring, as you can imagine, so I usually listen to podcasts or music, whatever I'm in the mood for. As it happens, when things started to get strange, I was listening to a mystery podcast, probably because it was around Halloween. So I'm listening to this creepy story, and I turn around with my mop in my hand and trip over this white cat. We get a lot of stray cats around here since the winters are so mild, but I hardly ever see a white cat, especially one like this that was all white. It was long-haired and well-fed, looked like a pet, not a stray. I thought it was probably just visiting, wandering around or whatever, and it would go home soon. When I left, it walked out and down the street, cool as you please, toward the graveyard. It disappeared into the graveyard, but I was sure it couldn't live there. I thought it must have gone to one of the houses behind it, since it did look well cared for. I didn't expect to see it again, but it showed up again the next night and trailed me for my whole shift. Now, I thought it had to be lost or astray. I took a picture of it and put it up on the lost animal social media pages, just in case. When I went out to my truck to go home, it went off toward the graveyard again. The day after that, I brought a can of cat food with me, and when the cat showed up, I opened the can and put it in front of it. The cat just walked away from it. I thought maybe it didn't like the food, so I brought some tuna next time. Every cat likes tuna. Not this one. I still didn't think there was anything weird about the cat, though. I hadn't figured out what was going on. No, I just thought someone else must be feeding it. But if that was true, then why was it hanging around? Sure, it was a little chilly outside, especially at night. But if it was cold, why did it always leave when I did? Maybe I thought it wanted attention. So I decided I'd try to pet it. But every time I reached down, it managed to sidestep and avoid my hand. I kept trying, though, and finally I got it cornered. It wasn't scared like it didn't hiss or anything, but it gave me a look. As if it was saying, "Do you really want to do this?" And I reached for it, but my hand went right through. I couldn't believe it. I reached out again and it sidestepped. That was when I had the thought, this is not a real cat. Okay, so what was it? And what did it want? I felt like it wanted something because it kept coming around and following me. Not food, not attention, so what? I felt like it was trying to tell me something. Every night it walked back toward the graveyard, so one night I followed it. But when I got to the graveyard, it walked behind one of the stones and was gone. Since I was already there, I started to look at the stones. They were kind of messed up, dirty, and so on. but it was dark, so I couldn't really read them. I looked around, trying to figure out where that cat could have gone. There are a couple of houses past the cemetery. I guessed it must have gone to one of them. I tried not to think about the fact that it looked like it had just disappeared. I couldn't help it, though. I kept thinking about that cemetery. Finally, one Saturday, I decided to clean it up. I loaded up the truck with everything I thought I'd need: weed trimmer, bleach, cloths, a pressure washer. I'd never cleaned gravestones before, but I cleaned everything else, so I figured I could handle it. I wasn't out there 10 minutes before people started showing up to help. One lady even brought flowers to put on the graves when we were done. I asked a few people if they knew anyone who'd lost a white cat. No one did, but a couple people said they'd seen one hanging around the graveyard. Never during the day, though, only at night. When we were done, the place looked great. Before we left, I took a look at the stone the cat had disappeared behind. The name didn't mean anything to me, but an old guy behind me said, "I knew him. He was a janitor at the school." I saw that he'd died in 1955 at the age of 72. On Monday, the cat didn't show up. I kind of missed it as I cleaned. I mean, it never did anything except follow me around while I worked, but still, it was some kind of company. I found myself looking for it every time I finished cleaning one room and started another. When it was time to leave, I stood outside for a minute, looking toward the graveyard. Finally, I saw the cat walking toward me. It didn't come all the way, just up to the sidewalk. It meowed, the first time I ever heard it do that. Then it went back to the graveyard. I never saw it again, but once every few months I go over to... Goldie is a golden retriever who's been with our family for over 5 years now. She loves to go camping with us. I have a travel trailer that I use a lot. Almost every weekend in the summer, the wife, my son, and I are camping at some campground. We live in Ohio, but we go all over to camp. This one weekend in June, we didn't travel far and camped at Mohican State Park. The second day there, I was taking Goldie for a walk along the river trails. We had been walking for about 30 minutes when I heard something from off the trail come barreling through the woods. I thought it was a deer or possibly a black bear, but then it stops. Like it must have caught wind of us or something. Goldie steps in front of me and starts doing this low growl at the woods. She sensed something was off right away, and the motion from this thing startled her at first. I'm standing there and I can't see anything because the woods were pretty thick in that area. I pulled her lead a little, signaling her that we need to turn around and go back, but she won't budge. Then I start to hear this thing come out from the woods. It's slowly making its way to the trail. I start yelling in case it's a bear, saying, "Get out of here, bear." But what happened next shocked me to my core. I'm yelling and Goldie is there growling like I've never seen her before. She's such a mild-mannered dog and total sweetheart. This monstrous, and I mean monstrous, figure comes walking out of the woods, making all kinds of noises as it's walking. Twigs and branches are snapping. It's just covered in long, dark fur from head to toe, except for its face. It stares right at me and raises it one hand. I'm not sure what it was doing, but it put its arm over its head and stood there making this grunting sound. Goldie at this point is going nuts, barking her head off, and it seems like this thing is annoyed at all of the barking and covered its ears. I'm trying to hold on to the lead as best as I can because Goldie just won't stop. This giant beast looks at Goldie, then turns and goes back into the woods. She wouldn't leave for another minute or so because I think she wanted to make sure the threat was gone. We eventually get back to camp, and I told my wife and kid about the entire experience. It was crazy, to say the least. We ended up going home later that afternoon. I did tell the local ranger about the incident, but I think he just passed it off as a black bear. That thing was a Sasquatch. I have no doubt in my mind. And my sweet girl saved me from whatever that thing intended to do. This past winter I went hunting, and if I knew what was going to transpire, I would have stayed home. My family owns a piece of property of about 20 acres, and we'd gone there every year for as long as I could remember. We had a tiny cottage on the property, nothing too big, but it was all we really needed. I drove in around 5 that evening and settled into the cottage. I intended to get a good night's sleep and get up early enough to catch the morning deer walking by. I was full of excitement, so it was hard to sleep. Each time I'd look at the clock, only minutes had gone by. As restless as I was, I figured I'd get back up and make myself a cup of hot tea to calm my nerves. I put a pot of water on the stove and slid on my jacket, stepping to step outside while I waited. The air was cool, and I took a deep breath in. I loved the fresh outdoor air, and I didn't get that much in the city. The sky was clear, and full moon cast its light over the tops of the trees. The aroma and coos of nightlife only fed my eagerness. I could hear the crickets humming and a distant howling wolf. I returned inside to steep my tea, then headed back outside. Now, the once distant wolf sounded a lot closer. It was pretty common for wolves to be out and about. However, for us hunters, that meant there was a possibility they would snag a deer right out from under your nose. I didn't mind them, though. After all, they needed to eat too, so I thought to myself, may the best predator win. Once I finished my tea, I headed back to bed. I awoke at 3 in the morning. I got ready and headed out to my deer tent that was smack dab in the middle of our property. I made myself cozy and waited in anticipation for the first wave of deer. One thing about hunting is you have to have a lot of patience, and you have to make very little movement or sound. I had been doing it for most of my life, so needless to say, I felt like a pro. Around an hour later, around 4 in the morning, the first wave of deer came. Most people would take their shot as soon as they could, but I liked to watch them graze on the fields for a little. It must have been a cluster mixed of around 10 deer, including does, baby deer. When hunting, it's frowned upon to shoot the mother deer if it's near the doe. Reason being, the doe still needs to grow alongside its mother so that it can survive and go off on its own. I figured that's 4 deer that were unaccompanied by a baby doe. I was just about to raise my gun when I heard leaves rustling. I looked and noticed something running towards the deer, and fast. I turned to face it directly, and before I knew what was happening, a wolf jolted and took a hold of a deer, making the rest of them scatter. There was a lot of commotion, and so I couldn't make anything out at first. But finally, everything settled, and then I could see something hunched over the deer. It looked like a wolf, only it had abnormally long legs. I couldn't compute what I was seeing. The wolf was huge, bigger than it should have been. And I watched as it stayed munching on the deer for a bit before dragging it off. I waited a good 15 minutes or so to make sure the coast was clear. I slung my gun over my shoulder, left the tent, and approached the area where the wolf ran up on the deer. Upon further examination, I noticed the tracks seemed off. I had been hunting all my life and could easily identify track marks from different animals. I thought it's possible it was a different breed. Or maybe when all the deer scattered their tracks and were mashed with the wolves. I was too shaken up to figure it out, though, and I didn't even want to try and wait for another herd to come by, so I packed up for the day and returned to the cabin. The rest of that evening I was restless. But this night it wasn't because of excitement. It was now 7 in the evening, and I just wanted to go to sleep so that I could go out tomorrow and score. Problem was, I wasn't tired. I decided to make a fire out back for the steak and cook up some soup in the kitchen. I was going back and forth from outside to the kitchen to check on my soup. At one point while inside, I glanced out the window at the fire and did a double take when a figure caught my eye. It watched as it prowled around the fire. This animal was too big and furry to be a common wolf. My first instinct was to grab my gun, which was in the next room. I got it and cocked it since it was already loaded. I then crept back to the window and saw the beast prop itself up on its back legs. The window was cracked just enough for the mouth of my gun to slide through, and I could get a clean shot if I needed to. The creature was distracted enough by the steak cooking that I had time to aim perfectly. And just as I was about to shoot a warning shot, the moon crept through the clouds. That made the beast turn abruptly and let out a loud howl. The howl spooked me, and my gun accidentally went off. I ducked below the window. My heart was racing, and I then slowly raised my head. I didn't see anything from my window, so I slowly cracked open the back door. Whatever it was long gone. I brought out a flashlight to check for blood, thinking I could have shot the beast, but there was no trace. I never went back to that cabin alone after that. Too much trauma for me. Because whatever creature I saw that day, I'm convinced it is still out there somewhere. In the winter of 2002, I was a police officer in Athens, Ohio, home of Ohio University. As any cop in a small college town will tell you, Thursday nights can get a little wild. Most of the kids leave campus on Friday night to head home and visit their parents, do laundry, and beg a little spending money for the week. So Thursday nights reign as party nights on campuses and in fraternities where kids would rather go to class hungover on Friday morning than forego the drinking entirely. I want to say it was mid-December and the last Thursday before finals week and subsequent Christmas break, making it the wildest Thursday night of the year. Ohio University is home to 4 fraternities and 3 sororities, and most of our Thursday night calls centered around the inhabitants of one of the more popular frat houses. In recent months, most of our calls to that particular fraternity had been centered around a series of practical jokes played on the elderly man who lived across the alley. He had made a few noise complaints, and it had created a sort of ongoing battle between him and the fraternity itself. I, personally, had been called out at least a half a dozen times to deal with these issues, and I can't even begin to guess how many other officers had been sent to deal with the same stuff on their shifts. The old guy's name was Eugene, and it would be unfair of me to make him out as some sweet, innocent man fallen victim to the immaturity of the boys that lived in the frat house. Eugene was a troublemaker too, and had a rap sheet as long as my arm from a lifetime of petty crime, and he certainly got his own blows in during the dispute. Between the fraternity poisoning Eugene's garden with Roundup and Eugene hitting the back windows of their house with a pellet gun, there were at least a dozen other instances of back-and-forth jabs that had turned from humorous to downright uncivil over time. A few weeks before the night in question, though, the battle came to an abrupt end when Eugene suffered a heart attack and died watching a football game at his sister's house. The whole street had been quiet since he left, and, somewhat ironically, the fraternity had held off their partying for a few weeks out of respect for Eugene. It seemed like a worthless gesture since what he really would have liked was for the partying to let up while he was alive, but myself and the other officers appreciated a few weeks of quiet patrols. I knew they wouldn't skip the Friday before finals and home, though, so I was ready to handle some complaints when I checked into work that night. It wasn't long before I got the first call out to the fraternity, not by a neighbor reporting noise, though. This call came from the boys at the frat house themselves. When I got there, they told me they'd been setting up for the party and someone had stolen the keg off the back porch. I chalked it up to a college prank, told them the keg would likely resurface later, or at another frat party, and that I'd make a report, but there wasn't much I could do without any solid leads. They weren't happy with me, but they couldn't argue. They knew by now how these things worked. I got back in my car and answered a couple more calls, a domestic dispute across town and a Christmas tree that had caught fire. I pulled over a girl for speeding. Then, as I was getting ready to park and wait for my next interaction, I got dispatched back to the fraternity a second time. Again, the call came from the frat boys themselves. When I got there, everyone was huddled in the living room toward the front of the house. The back door, which faced the alley, had been blown right off its hinges and was laying flat on the floor in the kitchen. The door facing and all was still attached. I asked what happened, but nobody really seemed to know. They were hanging out and drinking, they said, when suddenly the whole thing flew into the house like a gust of wind had hit it. But there hadn't been any strong winds. The streamers on the back porch were still undisturbed. I looked the door over and saw no evidence that it had been kicked in or a bomb had gone off either. It was really puzzling me, and I was beginning to wonder if the partiers weren't playing a prank on me. It was about that time that someone who was standing and looking out the hole where the back door used to be noticed someone walking around in Eugene's backyard. I turned and looked just in time to catch it too. It was clearly a person hunched over and sneaking behind the old shed behind Eugene's place, so I called out for them to stop. I knew nobody was supposed to be over there. I'd talked to Eugene's sister just the day before, and she told me she wasn't planning to start cleaning the house out until after Christmas passed. The figure never came back, though, nor did they emerge from the other side. I decided to head over and have a look. The snow had been falling on a few separate occasions since Eugene passed, and his backyard was blanketed in a clear and solid blanket of snow. There weren't even squirrel tracks anywhere to be seen, and certainly not adult human footprints either. There was no person hiding behind the shed. There was no indication that anyone had ever been over there at all. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe me and the witness both had been seeing things shadows from all the Christmas lights and trees around the area. Perhaps. But as I turned with my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of something through the window of the shed. There in the middle of the floor, in the middle of that locked shed, sat the stolen keg from earlier. I knew it was the same keg because the boys had reported earlier in the day that the liquor store had written the fraternity's name in black permanent marker across the side of it when they put it on reserve. I never told the kids. I just left it there and let Eugene have the last word. I can't believe I haven't told anyone about this before, but this happened years ago. I grew up in a really small town where everybody knew everybody, so I pretty much got free rein as long as I was back home before dinner. During the summer, I would spend hours every day playing in the woods behind my house. But then I got older, and my tiny community started feeling small. I needed to experience more. I was sick of hanging out with my parents and their friends. I wanted to get out in the world. Just before I wrapped up my senior year and a couple weeks after my 18th birthday, I got a college acceptance letter from one of my top schools. You would not believe how excited I was. When summer was over, I would finally be on my way to a nice university in a decent-sized city, far away from my boring little town. I started counting the days pretty much the second I graduated. I was hoping to spend the whole summer sleeping and playing video games so the time would pass quicker. Unfortunately, my parents had other ideas. They wanted us to spend time with family. My aunt, uncle, and little cousin would be coming to stay with us for a month, a whole month. My aunt and uncle were taking our guest room, which meant I had to share my room with my cousin Henry. I was livid. Not only was I still stuck at home until the fall, I also had to be roomies with a first grader. But it gets worse. My aunt and uncle just wanted to hang out with my parents all the time. So guess who got stuck Henry sitting? That's right, me. I figured out a pretty slick system, though. I'd just walk him to the woods or the swimming hole and let him go nuts while I read comics. He was occupied and happy I was occupied and, well, not completely miserable at least. Still, I was pretty mad. Mostly at my aunt and uncle for just passing their kid off on me, and my parents for going along with it. But I couldn't exactly take out my frustrations on them. So I did something, well, immature. I took it out on Henry. Look, it's not like I hurt him or anything. Even as upset as I was, I would never do that. I just, well, spooked him a bit. See, we have this local legend about a terrifying monster that lives in the woods. The details are a little fuzzy because they change depending on who you ask, but most people agree on red eyes, bat wings, horse head, and goat legs. Oh, and a tail like a cartoon devil. I started telling Henry all sorts of stories. He hung on to every word. It was so fascinating to him, he kept begging me to tell him more. Probably not the best thing to tell a first grader, but I told him about the livestock killings and the mysterious noises and the creepy shapes in the dark. Some of the stories were ones I heard from friends and neighbors as a kid. Everybody around here's got a cousin whose friend's great aunt saw it. Others I totally made up. Either way, Henry was hooked. We were both starting to have fun with it. I was enjoying the look on his face when I acted out a scary detail that literally just popped into my head. He started playing Monster Hunter imaginary games where he'd pretend to search the forest for signs of the monster. But of course, that was all during the daytime. You know how kids are. They're all bravado when the sun's out, but as soon as it's bedtime, they're scared of their own shadows. It was just before dinner one night. Suddenly, my uncle came up to me looking majorly ticked off. He said that Henry was crying, and it was my fault. Apparently, Henry had left his stuffed dog where he was playing in the woods earlier in the day. He knew exactly where it was, so my uncle told him to run and get it before dark, but Henry wouldn't go. He was too scared because he thought the monster was going to get him. Boy, if looks could kill, I'd be dead on 4 counts. Henry's parents were mad at me for making their kid cry, and my parents were mad at me for messing with my little cousin. And honestly, Henry crying was getting to me. I grumbled all the way across my yard and into the trees. It wasn't hard to find the stupid dog. I found it after literally only about 5 minutes of walking, sitting in the nest of leaves Henry had built for it. By that time, it was getting harder to see because the sun was going down, making everything hazy. I knew the woods like the back of my hand, but I wasn't stupid enough to get caught in them in the dark. The woods in New Jersey have all sorts of low-growing shrubs and things that exist to hide hole and trip you. I figured I was already in enough trouble without coming back with a sprained ankle. I turned around and started to head back, Henry's stupid stuffed dog under my arm, when I heard a scream. I thought someone might be in trouble, so I went to check it out. I knew there was a small clearing that dipped down into a mini valley about a dozen yards northwest of my parents' house. In the summer, we get hikers coming through the woods, and sometimes they camp in that clearing. The way the sound bounced, I thought the scream had come from there. I peeked out from behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. There was someone out there. It had its back turned, but there was no mistaking the bat wings, horse head, everything. The monster from my supposedly made-up stories was standing right there on the other side of the clearing. My heart was pounding so hard I was terrified the monster would hear it. Maybe if I didn't make any noises, it would just go away. Then I could run home. I just had to stay quiet. Really, really quiet. Then I could back away, get out of there, give Henry his stupid stuffed animal, and pretend none of this ever happened. But as I was trying to take deep breaths so my breathing wouldn't be loud, I accidentally shifted back, right onto a dry branch. It's every horror movie cliche ever, and yes, now I realize it's for a reason because it happens. But when that branch snapped, that thing out in the clearing heard me. I saw it turn, saw red eyes, and just sprinted. I've never run so fast in my life. The trees were literally blurring around me, and I know it was a pure miracle I didn't trip and fall flat on my face. To this day, I have no idea whether it was actually chasing me or not. I didn't care. If the back door to the kitchen hadn't been unlocked, I probably would have broken it down because I hit it running. Everyone was in the dining room eating and talking. I wanted to run in and start screaming to my parents. Legal adult or not, I wanted them to tell me everything was okay, but I didn't. Considering what I'd been telling Henry all this time, actually admitting to a monster encounter would look like me still trying to scare him. I ended up just returning Henry's dog, and my parents asked if I had learned my lesson. I gave a very emphatic yes, and they were happy with that. I never told them about what I saw, and I didn't tell Henry any more monster stories. Sometimes I don't even want to leave my house based on what I have seen. My family thinks I'm nutty, my friends think I am being ridiculous for attention, and the police. They literally told me that I needed to think of a better prank and hire a therapist. I'll tell you exactly what I have seen. There needs to be awareness out there. I traveled about 2.5 hours from my home to do some exploring in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'm not big on hiking or whatever, but I recently went through a breakup. I just wanted some fresh air and maybe even some nice nature pics for my Instagram. A nice adventure, I suppose. I parked and just started wandering. I didn't follow a specific path. I created my own. My phone was set to track my path so that I wouldn't get lost. Technology is great. As I was wandering, I got some pretty nice pics of some gigantic trees, some cool-looking spider webs, and even a little snake. I was really enjoying myself, making my own way, and just breathing. I had been going for almost 2 hours when I saw a large hole in one of the mountain walls. It wasn't too far from me, and it was a manageable climb. When I got to the hole, I stuck my head in, and it was so dark. So I turned on my phone's flashlight, and that's when I realized this was a cave. I got a little carried away thinking about how I had discovered a cave, wondering if anyone else had ever been here. It was exciting. Of course, I ducked down and walked in. I went in a few feet. I was being super careful, but I could see a smooth rock floor beneath me. I felt safe. So I kept walking forward, following the light from my flashlight, taking a picture here and there. I was maybe 15 or 16 feet in when I realized I was in a cavern, a cave room. There were a few openings in the walls surrounding the cavern. I picked the closest one to me and looked in. It was another tunnel. I could tell it was big enough to walk through, so I stepped through the opening and carefully walked a few more feet. I heard skittering. I stopped walking, thinking maybe I had kicked something. I looked all around on the ground and saw nothing. I heard skittering again. When I raised my phone up to look ahead of me, I saw a person. Only like not a person. It was fully nude and looked really malnourished. It was crouched down on its hands and feet about 4 feet in front of me. It was so pale, like maybe it had never been in the sun. Its face was sunken in, and I could clearly see its cheekbones. It had all black eyes, not just the pupils like us, but all black. Between its hands on the ground was a half-eaten rabbit. I don't want to get too detailed because some people may have weak stomachs. I honestly thought I might hurl. I heard the skittering sound again and realized that it was making that noise. I don't know how I knew, but it was calling for its friends or family. Back up. I don't know, but it was trying to communicate and not with me. I moved back towards the way I came, but I kept my flashlight on it. It didn't seem to like the light too much. It didn't even try to move towards me at all. I was able to get back through the hole. I took a quick look around and didn't see anything else. I ran for my life back the way I came. I could hear skittering and it was getting closer and louder. There had to be more than one. I felt like that rabbit, like I was being hunted. I was able to see the light from the original opening when I tripped. I dropped my phone, and I'm not even going to lie. I didn't even try to pick it up. I got right on up and got out of that hole. I ran down that mountain. I was panting so hard, but my adrenaline would not let me stop. I only stopped when I was sure nothing had followed me. I realized I had no phone and no idea where I was. Honestly, I was just happy to be alive. I did eventually find a trail and managed to make it back to my car. I went to the local police station, which was pointless. They wouldn't take me seriously, so I just drove home. I cried and screamed so much on the drive. When I got home, I checked my phone's location. When I used the satellite feature, all I could see was a heavily wooded area, no cave mouth. The last time I checked the location of my phone, it had moved over a mile away from the original place I dropped it. It only had about 3% battery left, so I'm sure it has long died. That's what happened. I feel like I could have been eaten. I'm so lucky that I didn't freeze up. I honestly wish I had taken a picture when I first saw that pale person. I didn't even think about it. All my other pictures were uploaded to the cloud. Anyways, I won't go into any unexplored caves anymore. I mean, even caves that have been explored are probably dangerous. I wouldn't go in one anymore. I'll be the first to admit that I wasn't the most career-driven person. I wasn't anything less than a slack-off growing up, and it's kind of a wonder I even graduated high school. But after that, it's not like I had a promising career in my future. I was looking at a life spent removing pests from suburban houses or risking my life to put out fires. And knowing my track record, I probably wouldn't have been good at either. I had a good couple of friends, though, and one of them was generous enough to offer me a job as a traveling salesman working for their uncle's company. It seemed like the only option as a deadbeat 22-year-old who'd been fired from their last 2 gigs. I happily accepted and mentally decided it was time for a change. So, I started up with the job, traveling to small neighboring towns in my beat-up Volkswagen for the first few months. I was making a modest living, and it felt good to complete a job well done. I was eventually told I had to go on the road for a 3-town trip, so I'd have to find a place to stay for a night. This job was anything but glamorous, and the lodging was up to me to figure out. With the limited means I had available, I was lucky to have even found the place I did called, the Crampton Lodge. The Crampton Lodge was not a lodge at all, but a 1-story, battered and beaten motel with an interminably lit vacancy sign. It was the only establishment I'd seen for miles, and having already hit 2 stops that day, I was tired and getting ready to sleep in the car. The motel lobby was dirty-looking and poorly lit. There was no one behind the desk, so I tapped my hand on the dinky little bell. An old, sleepy-looking man emerged from the back office with an unfriendly expression on his face. He almost wordlessly checked me into room number 4 and handed me the key. I offered a smile, but he was already shutting himself into the back office before I could do so. Room number 4 was expectedly unwelcoming. There was a dingy queen bed and a small, super old-school TV on top of a scuffed dresser. The bathroom was a horrible green tile from floor to ceiling. It made me dizzy. I turned on the TV to block out whatever sounds might carry over from the other rooms. The connection was pretty shabby, but I finally settled on some old black and white movie. I took a shower, but I felt grosser than I had before. Everything about this place was just off. I just wanted to fall asleep, wake up, and leave. But when I walked back into the bedroom, the TV station had changed. It was an entirely black screen with a perfectly defined graphic of a white square in the middle, growing and shrinking rhythmically. The picture quality was too good for the TV. I was puzzled. I tried to change the channel, but to no avail. When I pressed the power button on the remote, still nothing, and nothing even when I unplugged the TV from the wall. The screen just kept glowing back at me, that white square taunting me, growing and shrinking as it did. I was honestly pretty freaked out, and I was going to march right up to that grumpy old man at the front desk and demand a different room. But when I touched the handle of the door, I winced. It was hot, like there was a fire outside. I glimpsed out through the dinky blinds covering the window. No fire. But when I tried my hand on the door again, the heat was unbearable. I groaned. This was definitely the worst place on earth for a traveler. I saw movement through the gaps in the blinds. If I could get that person's attention, maybe they could help me out. I ducked my head around and under the blinds. There was someone out there all right, but it didn't look like they wanted to help me. Their faces were remarkably smooth and pale like a ghost. White, actually. As white as a piece of paper. Just inches from the glass of the window pane, this face stared expressionless and straight into me. It was hard to take in. They were completely bald, including their eyebrows. There were zero signs of aging whatsoever on their faces, just white stretched skin wrapped tightly around bone and tissue. The lips were a cold, bitter red like blood in the snow. I stared into their black eyeballs with a dry mouth. Had they been waiting for me? Where had they come from? They weren't standing there the first time I looked out, just seconds before. I watched as the figure reached a ghastly white hand up in front of their face. I don't know how or why, but I couldn't stop myself. I mirrored them with my hand, following in a trance as both of our palms pressed flatly together, separated only by the glass of the window. When we did this, I felt a surge of either blistering heat or blackening cold shoot up through my arm, sending me staggering backward. At the same time, the power in my room shut off, including the picture on the television. I sat on the ground, panting and terrified, for what felt like hours. I was too scared to get up, to look out the window. When the doorknob rattled and began to turn, I felt my heart drop to the bottom of my stomach. I gulped, but it was just the grumpy old man from the front desk. He had switched a fuse and the power would be back on shortly. I nodded, still in disbelief. I woke up the next morning in that same spot. I'd fallen asleep there. But when I saw that fresh light of morning, I had never been so relieved. I wasted no time in vacating that room, ready for the day of work, determined to do whatever it took to never wind up in a place like that again. I grew up in the late 90s near St. Helens, Oregon, which is half an hour directly north of Portland. It is forest on all sides except for where it reaches down to the Columbia River there, big logging town back in the day. I had a summer job between my sophomore and junior year working for my aunt and uncle. Basically, they owned a lot of property up on the hills and would grow specific trees and then let a company come in and cut down acres at a time for lumber. They'd have me go through and sort of clear out brush in specific areas to make it easier for the trucks to get through if the roads were overgrown. It was probably my third week hacking blackberry bushes. Up there by myself in 90-plus heat with a machete. Not the best job I ever had. So I got to the end of a road and there's a sort of clearing there. Super silent except for the bugs buzzing everywhere. And then I hear this giant crack, like a branch falling, which was pretty typical, or at least not unusual. But then it happened a second time, then a third. When it continued to happen, I knew that this wasn't just some trees falling. There was someone or something nearby making this noise. This was before cell phones were really a thing. Nobody really had them. So I had to make a choice. One, I could go back down the road to my truck, probably 3/4 of a mile, or two, I could wait and see if this sound continued and what it was. Back then I was a whole lot braver than I am now, or I guess you could call it stupid. Fine line between the two, I guess. I stayed where I was, standing in the clearing, machete in my left hand. The branches or trees or whatever it was continued to crash, and it seemed to be getting louder and closer. It went silent all of a sudden. And right then something whipped past my head. Then something else. Looked down and I thought it was rocks at first glance, but it was actually chunks of dirt, like it had been ripped out of the ground one handful at a time. The chunks kept coming and the pieces were getting bigger. One was the size of a football, and then a tire, and so on. I was surprised I hadn't been hit. I mean, I'd been dodging the incoming piles, but there was a lot of it coming at me. Then again it went silent, and the chunks stopped coming, and the branches started crashing, started again. Suddenly, what looked like an entire tree comes hurling down the hill. I jumped off to avoid it and knocked myself off my feet. There's just a huge amount of dust in the air at this point, and I'm covered in that dry, splintery kind of wood. I then looked up to where it had all been coming from, and I swear to God there's a guy standing there. Well, sort of a guy. I mean, it's Oregon, so someone living in the woods off the land wouldn't be as unusual as it would be in other places. But this guy, he's huge, like 12, maybe 15 feet. It's hard to tell because he's on a hill, but this was not just some Bigfoot. I wiped the dirt and wood rot from my face and looked back up. He's gone. I then hear it. The crashing goes on for a while. I feel like he's running away because the noise keeps getting quieter and further. I then took advantage of the quiet, knowing everything was at least at a standstill, and then I took off back to my truck. When I got back to it, I wheeled it around and took off faster than I should have in four-wheel drive. Also, I never went back. I quit the job even though my parents threw a fuss because my aunt and uncle were annoyed. But there was no way I was going back up there. I told them what happened, and they went up and looked around. I think they didn't expect to find what I described, so they figured out a way to just rationalize it. They said it was obviously a landslide. But I know that it wasn't just a landslide. The way those chunks of dirt were tossed through the air, it was like someone was aiming for me. Since then, I have tried to see if anyone else has had a similar experience up there. I ask as many people as I can who have lived in the area for a while. Once I met this one guy who works at a pawn shop who had something sort of similar happen to him. He said it happened back in the 80s when he was hiking on the other side of the same hill I was on. We've gotten together a couple times and compared descriptions of what we remember it looking like. He thought it was even taller than I did. He said he remembers it having a sloping back with long arms that were longer than normal and really dark yellow eyes. I can tell you for a fact there was someone there. I can also tell you for a fact that it was not Bigfoot like lots of people would want to instantly say when they think of a creature in the woods of Oregon. However, I've come to believe that it was a mountain troll protecting its territory. My relatives sold that piece of property eventually, without felling any of the trees. I don't know who ended up with it, but I think about going up there again one day. I'm from out here in Nevada, and we've got some weird stuff out here. I'm a security guard for the East Basin Mall. It's in the suburbs, a couple hours north of Vegas. I work the night shift, and it's a quiet sort of upscale area. Most of the time I'm just watching the camera feed with the guys and trying to run down the clock. At the beginning and end of each shift, I have to do a sweep. This is when me and 3 other guys walk the grounds and check that everything's all right. We take a lap outside the mall, then check each floor. It takes about an hour to walk the whole thing. My shift starts at 1 in the morning. Me and the guys start our sweep by checking the parking lot. There aren't supposed to be any stragglers aside from our own cars. We do our sweep and are ready to head back inside. When we're on shift, there's only one door we use to get in and out, and I always double-check that it's locked behind us. We reach the door and it's locked just how I left it. Now we're inside and patrolling the first floor. All the stores have been locked up for the night. We've only got half the lights on, so we all have our flashlights out just in case. I hear something moving around by the escalators, so I shine my light there. I don't see anything, so I figure it's just the mice. We head up to the second floor when there's this weird clicking sound, like someone's clicking a pen really fast but louder, and we can't tell where it's coming from. We're waving our flashlights all over the place but can't catch anything. One of the guys calls into the security team back in the office. He asks them to check the camera feed over where we're at. They say they don't see anything either. The sound keeps getting louder and it's got this odd rhythm to it. Now the thing is, we're on the second shift of the night. The mall's been locked up for almost 4 hours, and like I said, there's only one door we're using to get in the place. I'm thinking that it's either some equipment malfunction or some animal got in during the day and got lost. I told the security team to turn on the rest of the lights. Then we keep going on our rounds. We finish checking the rest of the floors, and the noise is gone. We don't see anything. All the stores are completely shuttered. They've got those metal curtains pulled down over the front windows. They're locked. It's literally impossible for anything to have broken into one of the stores. So now that things are all quiet, we're really resting easy, right? Because preventing a robbery is half the job. We're just about to hit the office when there's this loud banging noise in the walls. We're in the basement where the offices begin, and it's just a bunch of normal lock and key doors. Someone could definitely be in there, but we would have seen it, or the office guys would have seen it. And now we're trying to follow the sound. The banging's coming from this one office in the middle of the hall. I run to our office to grab the master key. By the time I get back and we open the door, the noise is echoing even louder, but the office is empty. So we lock the office back up and go join the other security guys. The banging sound is coming from somewhere above us. By now, we've turned on all the lights in the mall, and I decided we should do another sweep. I grabbed my guys, and we headed back up. We try to follow the sound as best we can, but it disappears for a few minutes, comes back. We're really chasing it all over. We got to the second floor trying to follow it, and I figured something must have gotten into the vents. That's the only way it could cover that much ground, and it's moving fast. We're running all over the place trying to keep up with it. We make it to the food court and stop. At this point, we've been chasing this thing for an hour and we're all tired. All the lights in the mall are turned on. I'm sitting down trying to catch my breath and trying to figure out how to write this up in the incident report. Something clicks right above me, so I look up. There's a ceiling tile moved out of place and this skinny white head poking out of it. It's got these big black eyes, and that's all I see before it's back in the vent. I can hear it clicking as it moves away. Now I don't know what I saw, but I asked the guys, and I'm the only one who got a look at it. We radio back to the office. They say they didn't catch anything on the cameras. The banging is far away now. We decided to head back to the security office. We keep hearing that banging and clicking, but none of us want to chase it anymore. It's been moving so fast all night that I had thought it was a raccoon. Whatever it was, we didn't have any business messing with it. That first sighting happened this summer, right before school let out. I'm still working the night shift. There's been a few nights now where we can hear that banging and clicking. I'm trying to get used to it because this is still a pretty good job. I don't want to quit just because of this one thing, whatever it is. But the mall's only so big, and one of these nights I'm going to see it again. Well, I've sure got a tale to tell you. I'm still processing it in all honesty, and my therapist says it's better to talk about it than to keep it all bottled inside. So I'll start off with a bit about me. I'm a junior in college at the University of Maine studying environmental science and engineering. I'm a big hiker, and I love to get outdoors in any capacity: running, skiing, tubing, fishing, camping, boating, or even bird watching. It is just a peaceful activity for me, and again, my therapist says it's good for me because it gives me some time away from my anxiety and peace and quiet. I wouldn't say I'm too skilled at bird watching, but I've gotten better this last semester because I took a class in ornithology. There are a few main points to birding that I learned. First, you always need a good pair of binoculars. Second, a field guide can be your best friend, but also your ears can be your most useful tool. Birds make all kinds of different calls depending on what they are trying to communicate. They might call for a mate, or that they've spotted food, or as a warning, or to communicate directions, or to signal danger. Some birds have lots of different calls and sounds and songs, and they usually have a variety of different pitches and vocalizations along with them. I've memorized the most common sounds here in the Northeast and can do a pretty good job matching them up with the correct bird. I've also been out hiking enough to recognize the look of most, depending on if they're a male or female, or a fledgling or an adult or a senior. There's a lot to learn, and I've been determined to learn it all. I've been going out almost every morning on the weekends to see what I can find. Early morning is usually the best time for birding because it's not too hot for them and some of their predators aren't up yet or have just gone to bed. You know what they say, the early bird gets the worm. I'd been hiking for about a mile in at Moose Point State Park, and I'd seen just about all of the regulars, some dark-eyed juncos, a pair of winter wrens, and a razorbill. It was a busy morning for the birds because it was the day after a big storm. I started to hike up a hill to get a better viewpoint and maybe catch some overstory birds flying by. I found a path that wound up the mountain and took me to a perfect aerial view in a clearing on some dusty rocks. I sat down and took a breather. It wasn't long before I felt a shadow fly over me. I looked up as quickly as I could, but I didn't see anything in the sky. Then I heard rustling in the trees about 100 yards away. I pulled out my binoculars to try and get a better look. All I could see was a hint of a black wing popping in and out of a massive pine tree. The entire trunk was swaying back and forth as needles and branches flew out in all directions. Suddenly, this creature popped out of the tree line. I thought it could have been a vulture or a raptor or an eagle, maybe an osprey, but the wings were far too large, and its face wasn't like a bird at all. In fact, the most shocking thing was that it didn't really have a face at all, only these bright red eyes that were tracking something down below. It had the body of a person almost, but it was covered in a thin layer of black fuzz. Its wings were huge and spread out almost 2 yards wide. I just couldn't believe my eyes. It started to dart down below the trees, and I stood up with my binoculars to follow it. For a while, the whole forest was silent, but then I heard the sounds of a deer. It was certainly a deer bleating and crying from pain. The leaves of another tree shook, And then out of a clearing below, this creature came flying by with a doe stuck between its talons. It was a bit off kilter from carrying its weight, but flapped its huge wings smoothly nonetheless. I followed the beast with my binoculars for as long as I could, but eventually it was out of my sight for good. I sat there in shock for a while, and then made my way down the hill to get out of that forest. As I approached the area where the deer got scooped up, I saw a mess of fallen trees, broken branches, and leaves strewn all about. Certainly a struggle had taken place. I got out of there as quickly as I could and spent the rest of the day Googling what I had seen. Although it seems unlikely to have been this far north, I do believe that I saw what is called a mothman. It certainly was not a normal bird or bat. I'm going to keep my eyes out for more signs of it, but I probably won't be venturing into those woods again on my own. I want to tell you about a terrifying experience that I had while camping in the Everglades in South Florida. My husband left our tent in the middle of the night to use the facilities, and I woke up when I heard him flat out running back to our campsite. He looked absolutely terrified when he got back to the tent and instantly motioned for me to stay quiet and follow him. I tried to ask him what was going on, but he just kept saying, "Wait, wait," as we walked through the darkness. As we approached the cinderblock building that housed the restrooms, I started hearing weird squeaky grunt noises, and I assumed that he'd come across boars or something. But we walked around the building, back into near total darkness, and it took a few minutes for my eyes to adjust. We followed a well-worn path for a bit, and I wondered how he knew where he was going when Matt pulled me into the trees. The sounds got louder, and suddenly he squeezed my hand and pointed through some leafy plants to what looked like a huddle of large birds. But then one of the creatures stood up. On two legs, it was a gigantic reptilian creature. It must have been 9 feet tall, and it looked like a cross between a human and an alligator. I thought I was imagining the distended jaw, but the moon suddenly came out and illuminated the bizarre facial features. It had half of an enormous snake hanging out of its mouth, and the other half of the snake was clutched in its massive claws. I stood completely still, waiting for my brain to process what my eyes were seeing. I could feel my husband shaking next to me, but I couldn't keep myself from gasping when 2 more creatures, smaller than the first but still massive, straightened up and looked directly towards the plants we were hiding behind. I could feel my husband shaking next to me, and I knew that I wasn't imagining things. My rational brain kept telling me that since Matt had managed to make his way back to our campsite earlier, that we would be able to get away. But my lizard brain was pumping adrenaline through my body, and I was resisting the fight-or-flight instinct that was screaming at me to turn and run. I don't think I blinked once. I was terrified that they would move closer to our hiding spot in the millisecond that my eyes would be closed. The creatures stood completely still with their snouts pointed in our direction. I was convinced that they were trying to find us by smelling us out, but we were downwind of the light breeze that was moving through the woods. After what seemed like an eternity, my husband grabbed my arm and motioned back toward the path. I took tiny steps. I was terrified of stepping on a stick or crunchy leaves or anything else that would give us away. Once we got back to the path, we walked slowly for 100 yards or so. But soon I couldn't take it anymore and started running flat out toward our campsite, looking over my shoulder the entire time. We spent the rest of the night in our truck with our headlights pointed in the direction we'd come from. Neither of us slept a wink, but agreed that we felt better with the metal shell of the vehicle between us and whatever was out there. We were hours away from home, and we were both so freaked out that it definitely wasn't a good idea for either of us to drive. But still, we knew we both wanted to go back to the spot once the sun was up to see how it looked in the daylight. The only question I asked was, "How did you find your way back to that spot the second time?" He said he just followed the sounds, just like the first time. The hours passed, and the sun started to ride, but I wanted full daylight before we headed back out. As we made our way back to the spot where we had seen the creatures, we listened for the strange pig-like noises we had heard the night before, but didn't hear a squeak. I didn't know if we would be able to find the area again, but Matt pointed out our sneaker prints in the dirt of the path, and soon we were standing in the spot where we'd been hiding the night before. After making sure the coast was clear, we made our way carefully toward the area where the creatures had been huddled the night before. The only indication that something had happened there during the night was a scattering of rattlesnake rattles and a few humongous footprints that looked like they had been left by dinosaurs. Back in the 80s, once a week, I would take the Amtrak from Houston to San Antonio to see my boyfriend. It left around 7 in the evening and arrived at the San Antonio station around midnight. At least that's what the schedule says. But you know Amtrak, it's never on time. In fact, sometimes we'll be sitting there in Houston for an hour or more waiting for the train. Other times we get on the train but get stopped somewhere along the way because of a freight train going through or whatever. Sometimes I don't even know what's going on because a lot of times they don't tell the passengers. Anyway, since it's nighttime, they usually leave the lights off in the train so people can sleep and relax, but I never sleep. I want to know what's going on around me. Since it's dark inside, you can usually see out. I like to watch the little towns go by. You never know what you're going to see out the window. Usually nothing but the backs of buildings, abandoned houses, mobile homes. Once in a while, though, I'll catch something interesting, like seeing into someone's window. Like a little snippet into their life, which I find interesting. One time it was fully dark. I don't remember what time, and we came to stop in the middle of nowhere. Who knows why? Probably a freight train had to use the track. While we sat there, I looked out the window and saw a big warehouse with a couple of lights on outside. It was surrounded by a rusty chain-link fence with a gate in it. The warehouse was one of those corrugated steel things, and it looked like the roof was caving in. Weeds and vines grew all up to the top of it. I figured it wasn't being used anymore, but then why the lights? Someone was paying the electric bill to keep those things on. So I kept looking at it, just wondering whether there might be anything in there, or maybe they just kept the lights on for security. Nothing happened while I watched. I don't know why I kept looking at it. After a while, the train started moving, and just as it did, I saw a car pull up to the gate. I think it was a black car, but it was hard to tell in the dark. The train pulled away before I could see if the car went in the gate. I forgot about the warehouse until a few weeks later, when we got stuck in the same spot again. I guess there must be a sidetrack there. This time, there were 4 or 5 cars parked near the warehouse when we stopped. As always, it was nighttime and hard to see completely, and the lights on the outside of the warehouse didn't exactly shine on the cars. I think there were people getting out of the cars and going inside the building this time. The big door looked like it was open, not all the way, but a crack, like enough for a person to get inside. After a while, I think I saw it close, but with all the shadows, it wasn't that easy to see. I wish I could have gotten a better look at the people, but some of them seemed to have black suits and others wore blue jumpsuits. You know, like the ones mechanics wear. They had some sort of equipment too, but small things they could carry in their hands. At least, I think it was equipment. Now I was really interested, but of course the train pulled away before anyone came back out of the building. But now I was completely invested in this, and I made a plan to start bringing my binoculars with me on future rides. On my next few rides, I waited for the train to get hung up there again, ready with my binoculars in hand, but just my luck, it didn't stop. Weeks passed without us stopping there, and I thought maybe they'd figured it out. Like, maybe the people in the cars knew they were visible to the train and that we might be able to see what they were doing. Maybe 5 weeks later, though, it finally happened again. The train stopped at that same spot, and I could see the warehouse with at least 5 cars in front. A couple of the cars in back had their headlights on. I quickly brought my binoculars up to my eyes and could finally see clearly what was going on. I could see that the warehouse door was open, and I watched as people started getting out of the cars in front. But they weren't all people, though. At least I don't think so. In between 2 of the black suits was a short, gray figure with a big head, and it looked to be naked. Maybe it was a small human, but I don't think so. It had a tiny body and a huge head, so if it was a human, it was disfigured or mutated in some way, and they were kind of dragging it with its feet behind it like maybe it was dead or passed out or sick. I watched as they dragged it inside the warehouse, and then 2 of the jumpsuits followed. They had one of the gray things between them too. Suddenly the headlights turned off and it was just the dim warehouse lights again. I don't think anyone else went inside after that, but it was hard to tell. There was movement and shadows, but none near the door. And then I turned the binoculars back towards the door and watched as it closed shut. I wish I could have watched to see if anyone came out again, but the train started moving. This time I didn't forget about any of it. I kept thinking about that warehouse. I really wanted to know what was going on there. I tried to find the street crossings on a map I went and got at AAA, but I couldn't find it. I wasn't sure where it was, and I didn't see any industrial area near where it seemed like it should be. I even studied the train route to see if there was a side rail that the train might have been on those times when we stopped. I even looked at a bunch of freight rail maps, but I couldn't find it. Dead end, everywhere I looked. The place seemed to be invisible. It wasn't even near a town as far as I could tell. I tried to note the time to figure out how many miles it was from Houston, but the train stopped so often that it was hard to tell. I decided I'd just have to wait to find out more. A few weeks went by before we stopped in that spot again. When we did, I wasn't sure it was even the same place. The only reason I knew it had to be, though, was that I remembered this tree with a big knot in it that was usually right near my window or maybe just a few feet away. The tree was there, but behind it now was a wall. It was one of those concrete walls like they use for sound barriers along the interstate. And the wall was close to the track, just behind the tree. The freakiest part, though, was that it looked like it had been there forever. I tried to see how far it went, but it just went off as far as I could see. I kept asking myself, was this the same spot? It seemed like it couldn't be. That tree, though, looked exactly the same. I need to tell you something that happened to me last year. I was sitting on my porch at my house in Washington late at night, enjoying the view of the starry sky. I heard a high-pitched whirring noise and then saw something quite strange. It was a vibrant blue light that appeared to be spinning. It slowly went higher up into the sky and gradually spun faster and faster. Eventually it disappeared behind a tree, and the whirring noise stopped. Fascinated, I continued looking, waiting for the light to come back, but it didn't. Then suddenly, I heard a huge explosive boom and the cloud lit up a bright green color. It was so bright it was blinding. It was an amazing and bewildering sight to behold. I had never seen anything like it before in my life. The blue light was spinning so fast it looked like a bright star shooting across the sky. The green light that followed was just as spectacular, if not more so. It lit up the entire cloud in a brilliant hue and created an incredible spectacle. I stood there amazed at the sight, completely mesmerized. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Afterwards, I saw green lights falling from behind the cloud towards the ground. I remember thinking that someone must be playing a prank on me, but it was far too epic to be a simple prank. I remember being concerned if some of the green debris would fall on someone's house or cause a fire, but there was really nothing I could do. I was in awe, and I couldn't stop gazing and wondering if I was dreaming. I thought that was going to be the most eventful part of the night, but I was wrong. Something quite disturbing happened afterwards. A strange-looking black van drove slowly into the field in front of my house. The windows were all blacked out, and it drove very slowly. I don't get many visitors and nobody lives around me, so I got very weirded out by the van. It disturbed me enough that I went into the house, locked the door, and peered out the window. The van sat in the field for about 10 minutes. Finally, I decided maybe I was being paranoid and fixed myself some tea. While drinking the tea, I kept trying to come up with a logical explanation for what I saw in the sky, but for the life of me, I couldn't explain it. It had to be extraterrestrial. Either that, or it had been some strange experimental government aircraft. But why the green explosion? I looked out the window again about 30 minutes later, and the van was still sitting in the field. I called my friend who works as a truck driver and was in a different state at the time and asked him what I should do. He told me it was probably nothing but to keep watching and call him if anything else happened. I hung up and tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went back outside and sat down on the porch. My mind was racing with the possibilities of who was in the van. I eventually told myself it was just some teenagers having sex in the field and laughed it off. The van suddenly began to move again. I told myself that the teenagers had finished what they came to do, and a sense of relief came over me. It drove very slowly towards my house and then stopped right in front. Now my heart started pounding as I wondered what was going on. Suddenly, all the doors of the van opened and 4 men dressed in black suits and sunglasses jumped out. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. They were all holding guns and they started running at me. As they came closer, I could see that their faces were covered with masks. I tried to run into the house, but one of them grabbed me and dragged me back outside. They took me to the van and forced me inside. The last thing I saw before they shut the door was 4 more men getting out of the back of the van with rifles. Then the van drove away, leaving me alone with these masked strangers. I remember waking up after that confused and disoriented with a pounding headache. I felt the grass on my hands, and I started to look around. Once the blurriness left my eyes, I realized that I was in my front yard. I immediately ran inside and called my partner, screaming and crying. After taking some deep breaths and forcing myself to calm down, I was able to tell him what happened while holding back tears. I told him I thought it had something to do with the strange lights in the sky. "What are you talking about?" he asked me. "The blue light and the green explosion that I told you about earlier, Craig," I screamed. There was a brief pause on the phone. "What light are you talking about, Jessica?" He told me I must be in shock from the trauma and I needed to call 911. He had no recollection of me calling him earlier that night at all. This experience has caused me a lot of suffering and confusion. I think about that experience daily, and when I tell people, not many of them believe me. In fact, it has cost me a lot, including some friends and family, my friendships, my career, my credibility, everything. I hope I heal from this experience and get some closure.